channel and I heard a story on a video a few months ago about a dead guy in a werewolf costume, and it reminded me of a creepy story of my own. I'm a bit of a slow writer, so it's taken forever to write it in, but here it is. Me and the boys were on a road trip from Scotland down to London for my pal's wee brother's stag do. Not a fan of the city, honestly. It's, well, London, and hang around Dawson or Camden for a few days as a tourist and you'll know exactly what I mean. And so normally I wouldn't be caught dead on a road trip down to that crap hole of a place, but all Jim's wee brother's Barry was getting married like, and for some cursed reason he'd asked Jim to be his best man and to bring his mates for the stag do. And it was kind of sad, actually. I found out later that Barry had moved down to London for his career, but hadn't really met anyone that he'd called a good friend. And his side of the wedding was looking as empty as a nun's body count. So us, being good boys, all piled into Jim's Vauxhall and made the trip from near Glasgow down to Kensington. Now, fun fact, did you know that there's a bar in Kensington that at least at one time was called the Cockpit? Unsure if it was one of those types of bars, but we tried to persuade Jim to make a stop there on our pub crawl, but he was having none of it. Now anyway, I'm rambling away like a twat, and the story isn't about the stag do, which went on like a charm. And same can't be said for the wedding. Effing Barry got cold feet at the last minute and called everything off, and he wasn't the flavor of the month for a while. Now this story is about the road trip. On the way there, before all the will they, won't they, no they bloody won't drama kicked off, I remember we were on some kind of back road just into England, but not the motorway. But there's no shiting way that I can tell the exact road and the exact junction with a precise detail that some of these lads who write into you can remember. It blows my mind, that does. Now what I do remember, though, was the hairy-fanged hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, holding up a sign that read, "Need to get to the Werewolves of London. Will pay for petrol." Now me and the lads had a proper laugh at this. And it was May, so this lad wasn't on his way to a Halloween party or anything. It looked like he was just using the Werewolves of London song as a sort of joke to try and actually get someone to stop and give him a ride for the lulz. Now, I was driving at this point and I decided screw it. It'd make for a mad story to tell at Barry's wedding, so about 300 yards past the guy, I decided to pull in and ask the others if they were all good with bringing this comedy hitchhiker along with us. Hell, he seemed like a good laugh. Maybe he could tag along to the stag do in full costume. Old Ewan fretted the F about it like he always does. What if the guy's a serial killer? He's dressed like a werewolf. That's so unsettling. And I said that there were 4 of us and one of him, and no actual hitchhiking serial killer dresses like a movie monster to lure in his victims. And it seemed to me like giving this lad a ride was just about the safest thing we could do, except for leaving him to just eat our dust. Now Jim and Andy were both up for it, so the arseholes voted that since it was my idea, I'd be the one to trudge back and offer him a lift. When I got out and shone a torch towards it, I was kind of surprised to discover that he hadn't started heading towards the car. Maybe he hadn't noticed us pulling in. The sun had set by now, and he probably had limited vision with that stupid party werewolf mask he had on. And so I shut the torch off and decided that I was going to have a little fun of my own. This guy was clearly down for some spooky shenanigans, trying to hitchhike as a werewolf, so I figured I'd sneak up on him and try to give him a scare before offering him the ride he'd obviously be grateful for. And so I snuck over the barrier onto the grass verge and snuck towards this weirdo hitchhiker. But before I did, I saw another car pull right beside the fellow, and the car's headlights were on and the hitchhiker had been standing under a street lamp, and so I had a good look at what was going on. A lad my age was driving, and it looked like he had a passenger around our age too. I saw him lean out and talk to the werewolf hitchhiker, and it looked like they were exchanging some good-natured banter. It seemed like the fellow was about to get his ride and we'd have to head off our way. And then I froze. From the bracken lining the road, 3 figures dressed in black, wearing balaclavas, snuck around the back of the car. One of them yanked the passenger out and tossed him onto the verge, and then started kicking him ferociously. Another one of the black-clad men kind of got the first guy to settle down, then they must have restrained or tied the passenger up or something, and sort of marched him off the road and onto the grass, so he wasn't in any danger of getting hit, I guess. Now, meanwhile, the other black-clad figure was having a tough old time with the driver trying to drag him out of the vehicle. And then the werewolf hitchhiker pulled out what looked to be a pistol and aimed it at the driver. Cue another beating, another tying up, and the driver being thrown into the grass siding to join his mate. The werewolf ripped his mask off, and I got a bit of a look at his face, and he had one of those sort of lip scars. You know, the ones that you get from corrective surgery as a wean, and I guess he didn't think any witnesses were around to catch his face. Suddenly, I was bricking it, because I realized that they were going to drive right past our idling car, and God knows what they'd do if they thought that we were witnesses. And imagine my relief when the carjackers gunned the engine and did a 180 on that empty road, and then shot off in the opposite direction. I ran to check on the driver and his passenger. They were bruised, and the passenger had been seemingly knocked unconscious, but the driver was just about awake. He gave the same story we'd had. This guy dressed as some comedy cartoon werewolf was clearly not going to be some threat, and it was actually a pretty clever way to put people at ease. I realized it worked the opposite way too. We'd all just been too adamant that this guy was safe that we didn't even consider some ploy. I managed to get some phone reception and immediately called the police. And then I called Jim back at the car and told him what had happened, and cue the lads all calling me variants of the C word as if this was my fault. Long story short, the cops told us that this was the third instance nearby of someone dressed as some furry hitchhiker using this comedy value to kick off a carjacking. The first two cars had been found burned a few miles away. No idea what the purpose was, and the same thing ended up happening with this latest car I found. I kept in touch with the driver, invited them to the stag do too, but they weren't really feeling up for it, obviously. We made it to the hotel at like 9 in the morning, and with one hell of a story to tell Barry. He seemed kind of distracted, even when the drinks were flowing and we were partying hard late that night, but obviously that was the old cold feet. Can't blame him for not being blown away by our story when he was planning on ditching his bride at the altar. I still think that was a prick move. Anyway, moral of the story is this: don't pick up any kind of hitchhikers. The harmless ones might just be the most dangerous. And if someone's dressed like a predator, maybe believe them. I see it all over the internet. Those stupid YouTube thumbnails of Dog Man, which definitely isn't just a werewolf given a name so he becomes some creepypasta. All those stories on the Chans and the Reddits and the pastas, you know the ones. Probably one of the most overused cryptids in my opinion because he's only supposedly to be found in Michigan, although people apparently see him all over and apparently people love him. Now I wonder how they'd feel if they knew that there is a Dog Man out there, or at least there was, and he's no cryptid. He called himself Dog Man, and he's very human, and he's more dangerous than any made-up creepypasta monster you could think of because he's real, and I know it because I've met him. It was about 7 years ago, and me and the bestie decided to set off on an extended spring-summer road trip from Michigan to Flagstaff, Arizona. We were off to visit our other high school bestie who'd just graduated college in Arizona and moved into her own place. Her boyfriend was on deployment, so she was going to be staying in the new place alone. Now cue our selfless act of going to stay with her on vacation. On the way, one of our overnight stops was a motel in Woodward, Oklahoma. Now sorry for all the place names and all of that, but they're relevant to the Dogman legend, I promise you. And it was a particularly hot month, so we were out sunbathing by the pool until pretty late into the evening, and then there had been a group of kids playing in the pool itself, and they must have ranged from around 8 years old to 12, and maybe made up of a few different groups of travelers who'd stopped at the motel, and one of them we found out later was the son of the motel owners. The kids were mostly ignoring us, playing with the pool noodles and toys, talking about whatever kids that age talked about back in 2019. Now, not quite the skibbity toilet or 6-7 years yet there, but occasionally thought that you could tell that a couple of the older kids were eavesdropping on our conversations, particularly when we talked about our plans of taking a walk into the woods just outside the motel. It seemed like a safe area, and we both felt like a late-night stroll. We've been fairly into camping in our college days, so a quick walk through the undergrowth with flashlights as the midnight hour dawned seemed suitably fun. Now, one of the kids, the motel owner's son, as I found out later and said previously, swam over to the edge of the pool and kind of lurked there for a bit. I could tell he wanted to say something to us, but was just too shy or nervous or hormonal to speak to a couple of sunbathing women. Now, eventually I took pity on him and asked him if he was having a good summer or something like that. The kid perked up at the attention and kind of mumbled that, yeah, he was having a good time. And then he just blurted it out. We shouldn't stay out after the sun had gone down, and we shouldn't go walking in the woods after dark. The sun was already beginning to set, so I asked him why. And over at the other side of the pool, I could see the other kids whispering to each other. They weren't giggling or acting like this was some kind of prank, though. They seemed genuinely serious as they spoke to each other. I asked the kid talking to us why we should be so careful. Was it a rough area? Were there wild animals in the woods, etc.? And the boy looked at me with absolute dead seriousness and said that Dogman was out there. Well, I kind of started laughing a lot about this and then realized that he was looking genuinely hurt and serious. And I told him that Dogman wasn't real, and even if he was, he supposedly lived in Michigan, where we were from. Now, he replied by saying that Dogman is definitely real, and I could ask his parents, who ran the motel, if I didn't believe him. Obviously, I wasn't going to start asking the motel owners about creepy pastas. I'd look like a total weirdo. And instead, I asked the kid if there were any other dangers in the woods or if it was just this Dogman. Now, he said it was just Dogman, and this Dogman kept everything else away. Now, I tried to reassure this kid by telling him that because we were from Michigan, Dogman's home state, we knew how to handle him and he wouldn't hurt us. And the kid looked very skeptical about this, but eventually just shrugged and swam back to his friends. Now, cue a few hours later. It had gotten cold, so we had gone outside, showered, and then changed into some light hiking gear. Both of us kept joking about running into Dogman and about whether there was a werewolf prowling the area. We were maybe 2 weeks away from a full moon, so we figured things were pretty safe, if, werewolves had been even real. Now, we knew there was a picnic spot in the woods for motel guests, so we decided to follow the trail leading there, and then use that as a base of sorts to head into the deeper woods. As we followed the trail, I noticed a sign lit up by the beam of my flashlight, and it read something like, "Picnic area ahead," but then there was a bunch of smaller text underneath. I got closer to read it, and it said something about how the motel owners strongly advised guests to stay on the trail and only use the area during daylight hours. It said that they weren't responsible for any guests who explored the woods after dark, and that the land beyond the picnic area was public land and not maintained by the hotel owners. And so the kid had been right, at least, that his parents advised people not to explore the woods after dark. That was very likely an insurance/safety thing, though. Heck, maybe they told their kid about a Dogman to keep him from getting into danger himself. That probably was the case. And we reached the picnic area, which seemed like it would have been nice in the daytime, making a note of which compass direction we were heading in and pushing forward into the woods in the direction that seemed the most accessible. We'd been walking around 20 minutes, taking in the nature, mostly the occasional owl or other unidentified birds, and it wasn't exactly a pretty forest, at least in the night, and the motel owners had certainly been right in that it wasn't well maintained. My friend kept worrying about twisting her ankle or cutting her leg on the tree branches, so we were discussing about heading back. And that's when we saw movement all around us. An animal. Well, multiple animals running noisily through the forest in the dark, making no effort to disguise their presence. And then we heard a bark, and both looked at each other, clearly thinking the same thing. More barking followed, and from what I could gather and make out, there were 3 dogs running around in the forest just a ways from us. They didn't seem interested in us, but they were certainly interested in something, barking and growling in general. It was hard to tell, and I didn't want to draw too much attention to us, but I did use the flashlight to try and spot the animals, since they would have clearly been able to smell us and attack if they were going to. From what I could tell, they were Rottweiler-type dogs, a couple black and tan ones, and then another that looked to be mostly tan. Now the main point is, they were all very big dogs. One of them was smaller than the others, which is how I could tell the two black and tan dogs apart, so I took that one for a growing pup. Now I've been so focused on the dogs that I didn't hear the rustling through the undergrowth or the sounds of footsteps until they were almost on us. And then, a huge man with a filthy coat and an almost glowing white beard burst out of the trees. His face was a mask of fury, at least what I could see of it behind the beard and without shining the flashlight straight into his face. He was holding a huge walking cane, about as tall as he was, with a bulbous wooden knot at the top, which looked like it could do some serious damage. And when the guy spoke, he had an accent that didn't quite sound American and also spoke like he wasn't used to talking much, almost like his vocal cords didn't get much of a workout often. The guy demanded to know what we were doing in his woods, especially two young women, and why we were so comfortable being in danger. I started to splutter some kind of response, which he completely ignored and whistled for the dogs to come to him. The three dogs, confirming my theory of how many there were, came bounding through the undergrowth and settled at their master's side. The biggest one was kind of foaming and drooling at the mouth as if he'd been on the verge of a catch or a kill, and they sat there obediently, but I could tell that they were wired with energy and desperate to be set free by their owner again. Now I started to speak again, but one of the dogs growled, almost warning me, and so I quickly fell silent. The old man started croaking at us that we were effing stupid B-words for walking in the woods at night because wasn't it obvious that something terrible was going to happen to us? And he didn't have time to protect everyone. And besides, his dogs were animals after all. They might mistake us for something else, and then there'd be nothing he could do. Now I started shaking at this as I saw all three dogs staring at me. Maybe I was imagining it, but it looked like they were staring hungrily now. Staring at me specifically too, and not my friend. And then, the old man told us that we needed to leave the way we came immediately, and that he was releasing his dogs to go back to their patrol. If they mistook us for something else, then that was on us. We were already turning to run before we heard the man tell his boys that they were free to go play. And thinking back, I'm not sure if running was actually a good idea. It might have given the dogs more of a reason to follow us. In fact, the youngest one did start chasing after us for a little bit, and to this day I don't know if he meant to do us harm or was just thinking we were playing. Now when we reached the picnic area, the dog just stopped, like he knew that he wasn't allowed to cross the boundary into the motel's land. And we didn't stop running though, and it's a miracle neither of us had injured ourselves by the time we sprinted back to our room. And we barely even had the energy to discuss what had happened. We both collapsed into our single beds, half-dressed, and slept until morning. And the next day on checkout, a teenage girl was handling the desk, and we hadn't seen her before. It had been an older man when we checked in who said that he was the owner, and I could see the family resemblance, though, between the owner, this girl, and the kid who'd spoken to us at the pool. Now, I very sheepishly told her that we'd gone walking in the woods and encountered a guy with these very vicious dogs. Now, the girl's face went kind of white, at least how I remembered it, and then she composed herself again. She explained that everyone just called him Dogman, and he'd patrol the forest every night with a constantly changing rotation of dogs. Nobody really knew how many dogs he had or where he lived and kept them, but she knew that he had at least 15. And she told me that her dad knew more about the guy, but would never talk about him, and that he'd just drummed it into his kids that they were to absolutely avoid Dogman at all costs and call the cops if he ever came into the motel property. And then she kind of glanced at a photo on the wall, so I went over to examine it. And it was an old army photo, looked to be from maybe the early 2000s, and it was a platoon led by a guy who I could clearly recognize as the motel owners, but quite a bit younger. But it was the guy on the far left who caught my attention. He was staring off into the distance, not looking at the camera like the rest of the unit, and in his hand he held a harness attached to a military dog that sat beside him. One of those dogs that sort of sniffed out mines, I figured. Now, the teenage girl remarked that it was a photo of her dad when he served in the army, just before he was honorably discharged and opened this place. She didn't comment on the man that I'd seen, the bearded soldier who bore more than a striking resemblance to Dogman. And the girl added one final thing. She told me that Dogman allegedly patrolled the forest every night with his army of dogs to prevent an unnatural occurrence. Everyone in the area knew he was unhinged, but they had no idea if or how he was dangerous. No local law enforcement wanted to go searching the deep woods for a man and his army of dogs, and honestly, I can't say that I blame them. And so next time you hear about the Dogman creepypasta, know that, yeah, there probably isn't some werewolf prowling Michigan, but somewhere in Oklahoma, there is a man that they call Dogman, and he's definitely someone to avoid. I'm willing to bet that I'm one of your older listeners at a grand old age of 67, and ever since I could talk, I'd tell my dad to put his rock and roll records on, and my entire family and I knew that music was in my blood. Guitarist, lead singer, hell, even drummer, they were in my future. Instead, I'm a retired accountant, but with how tired I feel these days and how much my joints ache, I'm not sure that the rock and roll life would have been for me. Now, I may not have found superstardom in a band, but I did attend plenty of concerts in my day. Bands who've split up, bands who aren't even alive anymore, some of the live shows I've seen could make you spit with jealousy. And the concert I was attending when this event happened was a show on Kiss's The Alive tour, and I can't even remember where the venue was these days, only that it wasn't the infamous Detroit show. Now, the problem with concerts back then was that I was 17 and still didn't have my license. Now, I was, according to our driver's ed teacher, the biggest liability behind the wheel that he'd ever seen, and I think I'm a bit of a better driver these days. Now, anyway, the point was, I could drive myself cross-country to see these shows, and my friends were into lame crap like Simon and Garfunkel or Bob Dylan. Of course, I realized these people weren't lame crap at all these days, but back then, I was all about the rock, baby. And so nobody wanted to spend 3 or 4 days in a car with me to chauffeur me to a concert they didn't even want to watch. And this meant that my best method of travel was taking the Greyhound bus. However, that cost money, and I was a broke high schooler, so I took the second best option: hitchhiking. I'd hitched a bunch of times when this happened, and everything had gone fine, which is a small miracle when you think about it. But my luck was about to run out when that old beaten-up red Volkswagen camper van pulled up, and I could see a long-haired guy in the driver's seat, and it looked like he was wearing an AC/DC shirt. Sick. And then the door slid open, and I saw the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen in all my life. She was the kind of girl you dream of when you're a 17-year-old boy, and then I saw another guy in the back, and my heart fell. He was obviously her boyfriend. Now, the girl asked where I was headed, and I told her that I was headed to the Kiss concert. It turns out that was exactly where they said they were going, and she said that I was welcome to ride with them as long as I didn't mind putting up with her annoying brothers. So, no boyfriends then, I guess. I didn't mind. I didn't mind at all. I was some 17-year-old kid. Drugs and rock and roll were on my mind pretty much all the time, and that's why I was totally psyched when, as soon as we got back on the road, the girl offered me a joint. I'm going to call her Janice because in my head at the time she reminded me of Janis Joplin. The other two guys can be Peter and Will, younger brother and the driver. Janice was quick to light up and seemed intent on filling the van with as much weed smoke as possible. The windows were closed, so it didn't take long before we were hotboxing ourselves, laughing at the stupidest crap. And I remember talking rock and roll and being a little surprised that the rock trio didn't really have much in the way of opinions when it came to rock music. Now, eventually, the joint had been smoked to within an inch of its life, and that's when I noticed it. The van stank. And I mean, it really stank. I'd never smelled anything like it, and it was suddenly so strong that I can't believe that even the weed masked it. And I'm telling you, it smelled like Sodom and Gomorrah in that vehicle. Not that I know what Sodom and Gomorrah smelled like, but I imagine it was exactly like that. Now, I don't know how to describe it. It was like the rot mixed with death, mixed with lavender, mixed with perfume and incense, and the lingering smell of weed. Throw in Peter's B.O., which I suddenly realized was almost intolerable as he moved across the seat to me, And how could these people tolerate this and with the windows closed? I wasn't exactly the most hygienic clean freak. I was a teenage boy with crusty socks tucked under my mattress. And boys, you'll know exactly what I mean by this, but this stench was too much. Suddenly Will looks back, taking his eyes off of the road for an alarming amount of time, and asked Janice and Peter if they thought Daddy was going to be okay. Now, okay, they weren't apparently siblings, and I know girls still call their fathers Daddy right into adulthood, but it was weird as heck to hear two grown men talking about Daddy. Peter insisted that this Daddy could look after himself. Janice started lamenting how it might affect Daddy because of the tragic events that happened to someone called Charlie. Now, I tried to insert myself into this conversation here, asking if Charlie was okay and if he was a member of the family. Janice giggled and told me that they didn't know Charlie, but they deeply loved him. The problem was that Daddy felt spiritually free while Charlie was allowed to work, and now he'd been usurped by the man. I got this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as I wondered if there was any chance they were talking about Charles Manson, and that Daddy was maybe one of his followers or acolytes who hadn't been caught or identified. Filled with idiotic teenage bravado, I decided to simply ask, acting as if I was some big fan of the murderous cult leader. Now, I had gone through a period where I tried to convince myself his music was good, so I wasn't totally lying. And instead of acknowledging me, Janice made it pretty clear that she didn't want to address the topic when she announced that it was way too hot in the van and how could any of us stand it. I just sat there as a teenage boy in awe as she stripped away her t-shirt, leaving herself completely bare-chested. I was a little taken aback at the cigarette burn scars that I could see on her body, but at least they looked old and healed. Janice made a big show of pretending that she hadn't noticed the effects that she had on me, but I could tell that she enjoyed the reaction because she kept asking me questions to direct my attention towards her and give me an excuse to look. The questions started out innocent enough, like how many girls had I made out with? 3, but I told her 8. Had I been with any of them? Yes, which was true, although it was the most awkward moment of my life for both of us, and to this day I'm not even sure if it really counts as such. And then she asked me if I'd ever hurt anyone. I said that yeah, probably, by accident, but she said no. Had I ever really hurt anyone? Like caused serious damage to another person? I said that no, I hadn't. Janice giggled and said neither had she, but that Peter had some stories. Peter, who was about 5'6" and skinny as a rake, didn't exactly look like the dangerous type, but you never know. Janice told me that I should take a look over the back seat to see the gift that they were bringing Daddy. My nose had acclimatized to the smell of Satan's sweaty butthole at this point, but as soon as I leaned over the back seat, it was like being hit with an olfactory WMD. I can't even describe the smell, but I can describe the source. If you're squeamish, maybe stop listening for 30 seconds. In the storage area of the VW was a clear plastic box filled with some kind of animal entrails. Now, the unidentified meat was crawling with maggots, some of which were just starting to emerge as flies. And I studied for as long as I could, trying to determine whether I was looking at a human body. I couldn't see any bones or anything besides rotting chunks of meat, and Janice asked me if she thought Daddy would like it. I had no idea what to say. I didn't want to offend these people and end up in that bucket, and at the same time I was somehow still taking in the sights Janice was offering. She was drawing my attention with her movements and her stretching, and she knew it, trying to put me at ease, I guess. In the end, I told her that I thought Daddy would love it and that it seemed to please everyone because it was met with a round of applause. Now, for half an hour we sat there awkwardly as I avoided asking about Daddy or their rotting cargo, and instead tried to direct the conversation back to music. Now, I soon began to suspect that they weren't attending this Kiss concert at all, and this is what snapped me out of my stupor. I had to get out of here, and there was no way that I was leaping out of a moving vehicle. Thankfully, these 3 idiots offered me an opportunity. Further up the highway was a gas station. Will announced that we needed gas, and Janice said that she was craving some beef jerky. Without seeming like my heart was about to explode with terror, I told them that I needed to use the bathroom, like really bad. and so they let me out and I ran to the outdoor restroom. I'm not sure what my plan was from there. Sneak out the back window, sneak into the gas station, and tell them that I was hitchhiking with a bunch of loonies carting around rotten meat who might be part of a satanic cult? I shouldn't have worried. From inside the restroom, I heard the sound of tires peeling away and a vehicle speeding off like their lives depended on it. Considering the VW was the only vehicle in the lot when we got there, I had a feeling that I was the one who'd been ditched. Now, sure enough, when I peeked out of the restroom, the VW was gone. My backpack, which I'd left in the camper in case it looked suspicious, had been thrown into the parking lot, its contents sort of thrown all over the ground. And like a dumb kid, my absolute first concern was to check the wad of money I had in my backpack. I was certain they'd robbed me, but no. Not only had they left all of my money, they specifically removed it from its hidden compartment in my backpack, as if to say, we could have stolen this, but we didn't. I went into the gas station and told the attendant, an older, kindly woman, everything, and I asked her advice, and she was a bit baffled. They hadn't technically committed a crime, but with all the cult crap going on following the Manson family's murder spree and capture, it was fairly obvious that they had something bad in mind, or it could have been an incredibly messed up prank on just some poor kid. And that's what the cops thought anyway. I wouldn't give my name during the call, and I don't think this helped my case, but I had a record and I really did not like cops. They told me it was probably just a prank and I should just count myself lucky, and then they hung up. But it still haunts me to this day. Were they some kind of sicko cult members who worship Manson? Who was this daddy figure? And were they just pranking me, screwing with the kid they picked up on the side of the road? In the years that followed my encounter, I kept an eye on the news for any raids on cult compounds. There seemed to be a few, but I have no way of telling if Janice, Will, and Peter were a part of them. So, I'm from Newcastle, born and raised, but I lived down south in Bristol for a few years now. Just after lockdown was lifted, I decided to take a quick road trip back home to see the parents and my old pals. It was the worst decision of my life and led to the scariest, most death-defying moment I've ever experienced. I was driving down the motorway on the way home, like you do, and I was heading towards an overpass, just one of many, and thought absolutely nothing of it. Why would I? You drive under dozens of these heading cross-country across the United Kingdom. And as I passed under the overpass and out the other side, something came smashing down onto the bonnet of my Ford. It took me a second or two to react, dangerously slow even, and then I realized some effing little effer had dropped a breeze block off of the overpass and right onto my car. Now you hear about this happening sometimes. Gangs of teens are just some dumb kids who don't realize that they're likely to kill someone by doing this. You just never expect it to happen to you. Thankfully, the motorway was pretty deserted and I was able to pull onto the hard shoulder. Now, the whole time my car was beginning to smoke and cracks were spiderwebbing up through my windscreen. I pulled over, jumped out, and then winced as I realized that I'd left my phone in the car and had to lean back in to get it out. I'd gotten out a meter or so from the vehicle when the windscreen shattered inwards completely, breaking apart into those sort of chunks of glass that the car windscreens do. Now, immediately I was on the phone with the coppers straight to 999, and I told them what had happened. My voice was shaking and almost cracking from the fact that I'd nearly bloody died. They talked me through everything, whether it was safe to put on my hazard lights and all that kind of stuff, and then they told me that I was the third person in the area to take a hit from that overpass, but the first to suffer such a risky bullseye. Now, I got kind of mad then and asked why they weren't monitoring the overpass to see who was doing this crap, and bless the lady on the phone, she was so patient with me. She explained that they had been monitoring the overpass, but they didn't have the manpower to keep watch 24/7, and I'd gotten extremely unlucky. And so, to their credit, the cops showed up very quickly, cordoned off the area, and then took me to the police station in the nearest town to give a statement. Now, they even gave me vouchers for a travel lodge and a car rental company because my car had to be taken in for forensic evidence. Now, I asked them what they expected to find from a shattered breeze block, and they said that they had to check anyway. And I got a bit suspicious and pressed the issue on this. Turns out that after cordoning my car off and driving me into town, they'd let it abandoned until the tow vehicle got there. In that time, someone had graffitied a cock along the side of the car, as well as opened the door and rifled through my glove compartment. And so they wanted to take the car into the impound and check it for evidence. Well, this process took months, and by then I managed to finally sort out a new car with my insurance company. And eventually, though, I did hear back from the cops. They'd found a couple of fingerprints. Oh joy, right? Well, the culprits who nearly killed me had been identified, and they were going to get their just desserts. Except they were all under 18, which meant the worst that they could face was a short stint in juvie, and they didn't even get that. I didn't even get to hear about all the details because apparently the culprits were like a lot younger than 18, but basically it was decided that they weren't intending to actually hit any cars or hurt anyone by dropping breeze blocks off of a freaking overpass. And so they got a warning on their criminal record, which will be expunged when they turn 18. And I got to enjoy the experience of nearly dying and then having to spend literal hours on the phone to my insurance company trying to get a payout in a new car. Next time I travel home to Newcastle, I'm taking the bloody train. Hey Joel, I got a quick one for you which happened to me and my family last summer. Now, we were off on a road trip for our summer vacation, something we'd always wanted to do as a family and never had. Now, I'd never do it again either for a whole bunch of reasons. Both the kids arguing constantly, me and the wife arguing constantly, the boring fatigue of driving endlessly, all sorts of reasons. But I think the biggest reason I'd skip out on another road trip vacation was Grandpa. We'd stopped at a national park for a picnic. I forget which one now, the whole thing was a bit of a hectic blur, and what I do remember is when we returned to the parking lot, there was a guy sitting in the back seat of my car. The car had been locked, and to this day I have no idea how he got in. He looked like he was maybe in his mid-20s, but he had extremely pale blonde hair, almost white, something I immediately noticed. I pulled open the door and began demanding, what gives? And he starts talking and calling himself Grandpa, telling us to hurry up and get in so we could get a move on. Now the kids come over because they were curious, and I was trying to gesture to my wife to take them away while also keeping an eye on this Grandpa character. And when he saw the kids, he got excited to see them and told them to hurry up and get in beside Grandpa so we could move on to our next stop. Somehow he knew exactly where we were going next, and that kind of unsettled the crap out of me. Meanwhile, the kids were unsettled because their actual grandpa, my father-in-law, had passed away a couple of months before our vacation. So this weird guy calling himself Grandpa, it kind of confused and scared my kids, both of whom were only 4 and 6 at the time. I slammed the door shut on the guy and began trying to get cell reception to call the cops. All the while I kept my eye on this grandpa when suddenly 2 things happened at once. 1, I actually got reception and my call started to go through to 911. 2, Grandpa pulled some kind of box cutter and began slashing at the back seats, freaking out and screaming. The car was mostly soundproof, but I could hear that he was just yelling gibberish, and for some reason slicing up the seats of my car. I got through to the operator and then the cops, and I was trying to explain what had happened, all while panicking because now this guy had some knife. Now, I remotely locked the car by this point, but it wouldn't be too hard for him to figure out how to let himself out. So immediately I'm telling dispatch that this guy has a knife, and she asks if there's anywhere safe my family can go and lock ourselves in while we wait for the cops to arrive. I remember that there's a restroom in the picnic area, so we all head there. Now, the wife takes our 2 kids and locks them in one stall, while I lock myself in the next one. We're in the women's restroom, and I'm praying that some poor girl doesn't come in and hear me frantically talking to the cops from some locked stall. Thankfully, I hadn't seen anyone else around in the area. I stayed on the phone with dispatch for what felt like a half hour, and eventually an officer came into the restroom and called out that we were safe to exit, but to prepare ourselves. And when I got outside, it was chaos. Our luggage had just been thrown around the entire area. The car had gouges from the box cutter all over it, and as I ran towards the vehicle, an officer tried to stop me, but it was too late. I could smell the smell. Grandpa had defecated on the back seat of the car, a lot, and it absolutely reeked in the summer heat. Now, we were driven to the nearest station. When we arrived, we were informed of the good news. They picked up this grandpa character walking down the freeway, and for some reason he was naked from the waist down and completely unable to explain who he was or why he'd done what he'd done, other than that he was grandpa. And as you can probably guess, it turned out to be drugs, and as far as I know, he's still in a court-mandated rehab program. Now, thankfully, I didn't have to get involved any further. We gave our statements, and that was kind of that. A cop very kindly offered to speak to his cousin, who ran a car rental firm, to make sure that we could continue our road trip vacation. Now, while it was a very generous offer, I think we were all just too unsettled, scared, and exhausted to take him up on it, and so instead we recovered the few belongings we were sure that Grandpa hadn't soiled on and took the Greyhound bus home. And so yeah, that was my fun little road trip story. It kind of keeps me up at night thinking about how much worse things could have been with my kids around, but maybe writing to you all will exorcise that demon. Screw drug abuse though, and screw road trips. I just wish that I knew how this lunatic had managed to get into our remotely locked, fairly modern vehicle without any kind of damage to the doors or anything. Oh, I think not knowing that drives me more mad than anything else, except worrying about what could have happened to my kids. Hopefully this grandpa guy is getting the help he clearly and desperately needs. I have an absolutely weird thing that happened to me a few years ago. So my brother and I live in different states, a day or so apart, and if we're going to hang out, then that means a road trip. That's fine by me. I love cruising the open road, top down, tunes blaring. I would have loved to have been around during that era of epic music. Oh well, I was born in 2002 and I'm 24 currently, if you want to feel old. And so the last rest stop that I'd pulled into, I bought one of those huge Slurpees, which was a big mistake. It was starting to play havoc on my bladder a lot sooner than I expected, and I couldn't see a sign for another rest stop coming up soon. I contemplated pulling over and just letting her rip in nature, but it wasn't exactly a deserted road. No, instead I kept driving, holding it in like a champion. Eventually, I saw a small rundown gas station on the side of the road with no real signage and kind of wondered how they ever even got business. I pulled in, didn't even lower my roof, and just flung myself out the door and ran to the restroom, praying that it wasn't one of those old types where you needed to get the key from the owners. Thankfully, it wasn't. I double-checked that I was heading into the men's room. These days, I'm paranoid about accidentally walking in on some chick and being labeled a predator. Now, thankfully I was, so I headed inside, just about peeing my pants, and all the stall doors were mysteriously closed, and I had the suspicion from the state of the place that they just simply locked the stalls up rather than fix or clean them. Now, why didn't I use a urinal, you ask? Well, there were 3, and every one of them was smashed in some way, and some big out-of-order signs covered the broken porcelain. Well, anyway, the final stall was open sort of ajar, and I figured that this had to be safe at least, and I thought about leaning down to check under the stall for feet, but A, that would mean lying on some sticky floor covered in God knows what, and B, imagine if someone had caught me doing that. Now instead, I just coincidentally pushed the door open, certain that everything would be fine. It was not fine. There was a woman standing on the closed toilet, and she was, to put it mildly, extremely morbidly obese. I could see her body pressing against the stall walls, and I was honestly surprised that she'd managed to get into the stall, let alone climb up into the toilet. She had some brown hair and no makeup, and she was wearing one of those moo-moo things for larger people. Now, confession, I used to be a complete fat ass myself, and I've only begun my gym journey recently, but I'm doing well, I think. And she was staring over my head like she was looking at herself in the bathroom mirror. I looked behind me and saw that the mirror was broken and barely there, so I'm not sure if she was even able to see herself. I called out to her. I couldn't think of what the hell to say to a woman standing on a toilet, so I just sort of said, "Excuse me, ma'am. This is the men's room. The women facilities are next door." And then she looked down at me like she'd noticed me for the first time. Her face was completely expressionless as she stared at me like she was looking straight through me. And despite the comical nature of this situation, there was something intensely creepy about this extremely large woman crammed into a toilet stall, standing on the toilet, looking down at me like she'd never seen a human being before. Now, I had absolutely no idea what to do. The way she was staring at me made me feel like some specimen or potentially a victim. Should I try and help her? Did she even need help? In the end, I decided to say screw it and pulled the stall door shut so I couldn't feel her eyes on me. And then, I'm ashamed to say, my own bladder situation was so bad that I allowed myself to pee in the sink. I kept one eye on the entrance, but if the creepy staring woman caught me, then that was her own fault for being a weird bathroom lurker. And I went into the gas station to tell the owners everything. Well, everything apart from the peeing in the sink aspect. The guy working the register was a bored-looking kid around my age, and I had to repeat myself 3 times before I realized that he had earbuds in. I waved in his face to get his attention, which seemed to annoy him. I told him about the woman in the bathroom and how it had all played out. He sighed and rolled his eyes and said that he was sick of us playing the same prank, so me and my buddies should just knock it off. I tried to explain I wasn't even from the area and it wasn't a prank, and if he'd just go look, he could see for himself. He pointed out that this would leave the store completely unattended, and I told him I'd come with him. Now he countered with the fact that I could have accomplices. I told him to lock up, and in the end he got pretty angry and told me that he wasn't just going to do anything at all about this made-up nonsense. I glanced out the window, frustrated as hell, and then I saw the huge woman standing by my car, slipping a piece of paper under my wiper. And I started yelling to the cashier that there she was, if he'd just look. And the idiot absolutely flat out refused. He wasn't falling for my crap, quote unquote, and I begged and pleaded, and eventually he did look. And you know what? By the time this lazy-ass cashier took a look, the woman had squeezed herself into her own comically tiny smart car and zoomed off. I told the cashier that I would take my business elsewhere, with a lot more profanity, and went outside to see what the creepy woman had left on my windshield. Now, it was a note that just read, "Carl will be over at 6," in this very barely legible writing. And the next day, I made it to my brother's. I told him everything that had happened, and he was especially creeped out because the woman sounded word for word like the assistant that we had at kindergarten who'd just been a little slow and who just kind of sat in the corner looking at the kids. Except this would have been maybe 20 years ago, and he was sure that from the description that she sounded the same age. The really creepy part, when at 6 p.m. on the dot, the doorbell rang, and my brother answered it, and it was one of his buddies, Kyle. Not quite Carl, but close enough. But he'd only dropped around to hang out, and that was no mystery really there. And I hung out with my brother for about a week and then headed home. When I reached home, I had a message from my brother. And on his way from leaving my brother's place, Kyle got into a car accident. He had 2 broken legs, but was set to make a full recovery. So was it a coincidence, or did this woman somehow have a premonition of Kyle and not Carl getting into an accident? And if so, why did she tell me what time he'd be visiting? I don't believe in the paranormal. I think it was weird and a creepy coincidence where we can see patterns where there was none. But I can tell you one thing. I never use public restrooms anymore, and I'd rather get caught peeing in the public than open a stall door and see that woman standing on the toilet, staring blankly over my head. Along the silent roads of Suffolk, bodies began to appear, each one a message no one can decipher. As the darkness tightens its grip, whispers of a faceless killer spread, leaving a community trapped between fear and the unknown. Hear the entire story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Now enjoy the stories. Hola, Joel. My name is Maria, and although I think I'm a little older than your usual crowd, I think my story is just as scary as any other. Back when I was just 21 years young, I went on a date with a guy in my home state of Florida. Since it was our first date, I felt nervous as hell just sitting across from this guy I'd met at a friend's party a week earlier. His name was Roddy, short for Rodrigo, and he seemed really nice. He had a cute smile, he was kind of shy, and he worked at a record store downtown. This was 1983, and Miami was buzzing, and I was excited for our first date at this little Cuban restaurant in Little Havana. I'd never been there before, but everyone said the food was amazing and it had this cozy vibe with colorful tiles and old photos on the walls. Roddy picked me up at my apartment and we drove to the restaurant in his beat-up Chevy, and I wanted to make a good impression, but I was already second-guessing everything by the time I got there. The air was warm and sticky. It was typical Miami, and the radio played some new wave song that I pretended to like. And I just remember fidgeting with my bracelet, trying to calm my nerves. And then when we walked into the restaurant, the smell of roasted pork and fresh coffee hit me, and I started to relax a little. The place was packed. Families were laughing and waiters rushing around, and we got a small table near the window, and I remember thinking how the streetlights outside made everything just feel alive. We ordered some food, and I was just starting to feel like maybe this date wouldn't be a disaster. Roddy was telling me about some vinyl he'd found at work, and I was trying to act interested even though I wasn't big into music. I sipped my soda and I glanced out the window every now and then. The street was busy, with cars cruising by and people walking under the neon signs, and everything felt normal, like any other night in Miami, and then it happened. I didn't even realize what was going on at first. There was this loud pop, like firecrackers, and the window next to us shattered. Glass sprayed everywhere and I froze, my heart pounding harder than I'd ever felt before. The pops kept coming, fast and sharp, and people started screaming. I ducked under a table, my hands over my head, not even thinking, just moving on instinct. I could feel bits of glass under my palms. My dress was probably ruined, but I didn't care. All I could think was, please God, I don't want to die. And Roddy was under the table with me, and his face I remember being pale as a ghost. I could hear plates crashing, chairs scraping, and more screams. The gunfire kept coming, but it wasn't like in the movies. It was messy, chaotic, so loud that my ears were ringing, and I kept waiting for it to stop, but it felt like forever. I was shaking. My breath was coming in these short gasps, and I couldn't stop picturing someone bursting through the door to finish us off. I didn't know what was happening or why it was happening. All I knew was that I was terrified. When the shooting finally stopped, it was like the world held its breath. There was this terrible silence at first, one that was eventually broken by people crying or shouting in Spanish. I stayed under the table, too scared to move. Roddy grabbed my hand, and even though it felt weirdly intimate for our first date, I let him. But my mind was racing. Were we safe? Was the shooter gone? Or was he just waiting for round two? I kept thinking about my mom, how I hadn't called her that day, and how I might never get the chance ever again. And somehow, I think it was a waiter, yelled that everything was over, and for everyone to stay calm. I peeked out from under the table. The restaurant was a mess. There were tables flipped over, food spilled everywhere, glass glittering on the floor like little razor-sharp pieces of confetti. People were huddled together, some crying, others checking on each other. I saw an older woman holding a napkin to her arm with blood seeping through and staining the white fabric. But thankfully, that was the worst injury I saw. Nobody seemed to be dead, and although I felt a wave of relief, my body wouldn't stop shaking. Roddy helped me to my feet, and for a few seconds we just stood there, looking around and not knowing what to do. The air smelled like something burning and spilled coffee. My ears were still ringing, my legs felt like jelly. I noticed my dress had a tear at the hem, and for some reason, that there made me want to cry. It was such a stupid thing to care about when I just thought that I was about to die, but all of it just kind of hit me really hard. I kept thinking it was supposed to be a fun night, but somehow it turned into a nightmare. Police sirens started wailing outside, and soon there were cops everywhere asking questions and telling us to stay put. I heard someone say it was a Cuban dissident, someone angry about politics who shot up the place to make a point. They didn't want to kill anyone, they just wanted to wreck the restaurant. And I didn't understand any of it. Why that place? Why that night? I felt this weird mix of relief that no one was seriously hurt, but also an anger that someone could be so evil as to ruin a normal night and put people's lives at risk, all for nothing more than politics. And before we left, me and Roddy gave our statements to the police. I don't even remember what I said. My mind was foggy, but once we were done, they told us we could leave. Roddy offered to drive me and I nodded, still too shaken to argue and not wanting to be alone. We didn't talk much on the way back. The radio was off and the city felt different, like it had shown me a side that I didn't want to see. When we got to my apartment, I just sat in his car for a minute, not ready to be alone. He asked me if I was okay and I said yeah, even though I clearly wasn't. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sound of the gunfire and the way the glass exploded, the way my heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I kept thinking about how I'd been so worried about my hair or whether Roddy liked me, and then the world turned upside down in a second. It made everything feel so fragile, like anything could happen at any time. Roddy called the next day to check on me and we talked a little about what happened. We went out again a week later, but it wasn't the same. The spark was gone, maybe because we'd shared something so intense too soon, and I didn't blame him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the date had been doomed from the start. The restaurant stayed closed for a while, and I never went back, even after it reopened. I couldn't imagine sitting there again, eating like nothing had happened. And for a long time I got nervous in crowded places. Every loud noise made me jump, and I'd see a car backfire, hear a door slam, and feel that same panic in my chest. I started avoiding Little Havana altogether, which was silly because it wasn't the neighborhood's fault. I just couldn't handle the memories. But over time, things got better. I went on other dates and laughed and felt normal again. But obviously that night stuck with me like a scar that you forget about until you catch a glimpse of it. It was the night that I learned how quickly everything can change and how you can plan for a perfect evening and end up hiding underneath a table, praying you'll make it out alive. So I've been a listener for a while and I love your stories, and I think that you might like to read one of mine which involves my terrible dating life. His name was Jay and we'd matched on an app. He seemed confident, maybe a bit cocky, but in a charming way. He was a dude from a rough part of town, always posting about his souped-up car and flashy sneakers on social media. Hood rich, I guess you could call it. Big attitude, bigger dreams, but probably not much in his bank account. Still, he had a vibe and I was curious. He suggested we go for a drive, maybe grab some food somewhere low-key, and it sounded fun, so I said yes. I've been looking forward to the date for days. I got ready that evening, keeping it simple, jeans, a cute top, some sneakers in case we ended up walking somewhere, and Jay pulled up outside my flat in this really loud and shiny car. The thing was decked out with tinted windows, had some low suspension, and a very bass-heavy sound system that actually rattled the windows before I even stepped outside. And he leaned out the driver's side window, kinda smiling, and I hopped in. And the car smelled like air freshener and this leather polish. He was wearing a tracksuit, all designer and a gold chain that looked heavier than it needed to be. I thought he was trying a bit hard, but I guess I didn't mind. He seemed excited to show off. And we drove through the city, music was blaring, and I was having a decent time. Jay was chatty, telling me about his car and how he'd saved up for the mods and how he'd been in a few street races. I wasn't actually sure if he was exaggerating, but I just kinda nodded along. And the streets were busy, lights were flashing, and I was starting to relax and thinking this might actually be a fun night. And he asked if I wanted to see what the car could do, and I just shrugged, thinking he'd just rev the engine or something. But that was a big mistake. We pulled onto a quieter road, and Jay's whole vibe changed. His smile got wider, and he started driving faster, way faster. The speedometer climbed and my stomach flipped as the car roared. I gripped the seat, trying to play it cool, but I was clearly nervous. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to seem boring. And he was weaving through traffic, cutting corners, and I could feel the car vibrating underneath me. And I kept thinking that he'd slow down, but he didn't. And then I heard it. Sirens behind us. At first I thought it was just an ambulance maybe, but Jay's face got excited. He glanced in the rearview mirror and swore under his breath. I turned around and saw these flashing lights behind us, and my heart sank. Police, 2 cars, maybe 3 right on our tail. I asked what was going on, but Jay didn't answer. He just floored it. And the car pushed forward, and I was just pinned in my seat. We were flying now, way over the speed limit, dodging other cars like something out of a movie. My hands were sweaty and my chest was feeling tight. I wanted to scream at him to stop, but my voice was just stuck, like a dream. The sirens were louder, closer, and I could see the police cars in the side mirror, and their lights were blinding me. Jay was focused, hands gripping the wheel, but I could tell that he was panicking too. The city started to blur past. Street lights, buildings, everything just looked like a streak, and I didn't know where we were anymore. We hit this long stretch of road, and I thought that maybe we might actually lose them, but the police didn't stop. I heard a loud bang, and the car swerved hard. My head slammed against the window, and I remember yelling. Jay shouted something, but I couldn't make it out over the noise. I looked back and saw one of the police cars had rammed us. The rear of that BMW was crumpled, and the back windshield was cracked. I realized later it was one of those pit maneuvers that I'd seen on TV where they hit your car and try to make it spin out, and if you asked me, it worked a little bit too well. The car started to skid, the tires were screeching, and we spun across the road before coming to a stop. I was shaking, my ears were ringing from the impact. Before I could process what was happening, there was another crash, and glass exploded everywhere. The driver's side window was suddenly gone, shattered by something heavy, maybe a baton, I have no idea. I just remember screaming, covering my face as those shards started to rain into the car. My window was the next to smash, and I felt the air rush in. I looked up and there were police everywhere, surrounding us. The cars were angled to block us in, lights flashing so bright that it was hurting my eyes, and I saw guns. Actual guns, not just like stun guns, pointed right at me through the broken windows. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might explode. I froze, hands up trying to show that I wasn't a threat. Jay was yelling, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. The police were shouting too, telling us to get out with our hands up. And I was terrified, but I managed to open the door and stumble out. The road was cold under my feet, and I realized that I'd lost a shoe somewhere in the chaos. My hands were trembling as I held them above my head and kept my eyes down, too scared to even look at the officers. They grabbed me, not roughly but firmly, and pulled me away from the car. I saw them drag Jay out, pinning him to the ground. He was still shouting, something about how they had no right, but they weren't listening. I was led to the side of the road where an officer started asking me questions. They wanted to know my name, what I was doing, if I knew why Jay ran. And I told them it was our first date, that I had no idea what was going on. My voice was shaky, and I felt tears filling up in my eyes, but I held it together. The police searched me, checked my bag while I stood there, shivering and humiliated while cars slowed down and their passengers were just staring at us. And the police kept me there for what felt like forever, asking the same questions over and over. And I told them I barely knew Jay, that I'd literally just met him online, but I could tell they didn't fully believe me. They said the car was flagged for something. It was stolen maybe, or linked to a crime. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. All I could think about was how I'd ended up here on the side of the road, surrounded by cops with guns, all because I thought a drive with a guy might be fun. And eventually they let me go. They didn't arrest me, thank God, but they took my details and said they might call later. Obviously, Jay wasn't so lucky. He got cuffed and shoved into the back of a police van, and I didn't stick around to see what happened next. One of the officers drove me home, and I sat in the back of the car staring out the window. When I got to my place, I locked the door, sank onto the couch, and just sat there trying to process everything. My phone was blowing up with texts and calls from friends, and they were most probably wondering how the date went, but I honestly couldn't bring myself to answer. I eventually deleted Jay's number, unmatched him on the app, and swore that I'd never go on a date ever again. All I wanted was a fun night out, and instead, I got to experience what it was like to pretty much play Grand Theft Auto in real life. I'd been excited about my date with Alexei. He was a handsome Greek boy, successful and wealthy, and everything that sounded perfect on paper. We met through a mutual friend who said he was a great catch, and when he asked me out to lunch, I thought it could be fun. I got ready and headed to the fancy restaurant that he'd picked out. It was one of those places with white tablecloths and waiters who kind of hovered, and I felt a little out of my element, but I was ready to give it a chance. And the date started off okay. Alexei showed up in a sleek car wearing a tailored suit, and he had this confident smile that made me think he was used to getting his way. We sat down and I noticed that he didn't even look at the menu before ordering for both of us. Now, I thought it was a bit odd, but I let it slide, figuring that he just wanted to take charge. The food came quickly and I tried to make small talk, asking about his work and his hobbies, and he answered in short, clipped sentences like he was too important to bother with details. It felt like he was sizing me up instead of actually listening. And then I noticed how he treated the waiter. When the guy brought the wrong wine, Alexei snapped at him. His voice was sharp and cold, saying that he shouldn't have to explain himself to someone who couldn't do their job right. The waiter apologized, but Alexei kept going, calling him incompetent with this low, cutting tone. And I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't just impatience, it was cruel. I tried to change the subject, but Alexei barely acknowledged me, like I was just there to fill a seat. He rushed through the meal, checked his watch every few minutes, and when the bill came, he tossed his credit card down without even looking at it. I offered to split it just to be polite, but he waved me off, saying it was nothing. By the end of lunch, I knew that I didn't want to see him again. His controlling vibe, the way he treated people, it was a hard pass, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make a scene, and honestly, I just wanted to get home. My car was in the shop, so I'd taken a cab to the restaurant. When Alexei offered to drive me home, I hesitated, but it was a long way back and I didn't have much cash for another cab. I figured that I could handle a short ride, smile, and say goodbye forever. We got into his car, and at first it seemed fine. He asked for my address and I gave it to him, expecting a quick trip. But as we drove, I noticed that he wasn't heading toward my neighborhood. The city streets turned into quieter roads and then into winding country lanes with nothing but fields and trees. I asked where he was going, trying to keep my voice calm, but he just sort of smirked and said he was taking a scenic route. And at that point, my heart started pounding. Now, this was well before cell phones, so I had no way of calling anyone, no way to tell anyone where I was. I was just alone with some guy, and the further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The countryside stretched out, empty and endless. No houses, no gas stations, just open fields and the occasional barn. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I asked again, more firmly, to take me home. Alexei's demeanor changed. His voice got low, and he said he'd figured me out. He thought I'd used him for a free lunch, that I'd played him by letting him pay and acting like I was interested when I had no intention of seeing him again. He'd said I'd wasted his time and his gas money, like I'd tricked him on purpose. I tried to explain that I hadn't meant to mislead him, that I just didn't feel a connection, but he wasn't listening. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He looked at me, his eyes were very hard, and he said he could drive me deeper into the middle of nowhere. He said he could do whatever he wanted, and no one would find me for days, maybe weeks. And my whole body seized up. I didn't know if he was serious or just trying to scare me, but at that moment, I believed he could do it. I was trapped in his car, miles from anywhere, with no way to get help. And I felt so small, so helpless, and I started begging him to take me home. My voice was shaking, trying to keep him calm. I told him I was sorry, that I didn't mean to upset him, anything to get him to turn the car around. He didn't say much after that. He just kept driving, his hands tight on the wheel, while I sat there, my heart racing, watching the empty fields roll by. I kept thinking about how no one knew where I was, how I'd made a mistake getting into his car. I thought about my family, my friends, and how I might not see them again if this went wrong. It felt like hours, though it was probably less, before he finally turned the car around. He didn't say why, didn't explain. He just started heading back toward town, and I didn't dare say anything to risk changing his mind. When we finally pulled into my neighborhood, I felt like I could breathe again, but I was still shaking. He stopped in front of my apartment and I reached for the door handle, desperate to get out. Before I could, he grabbed my arm, looked me in the eye and said that he could have done anything to me out there, and no one would have stopped him. He said I should remember that. And then he let go, and I stumbled out of the car, barely able to stand. I didn't look back as he drove off. I just ran inside, locked the door, and sat there trying to process what had happened. I reported it to the police the next day. I was scared, but I couldn't let it go. I told them everything, how he'd driven me out to the countryside, what he'd said, and how he'd made me feel like my life was in his hands. They brought him in, but Alexei told a completely different story. He'd said he'd just driven me home like I'd asked, and that he'd taken a longer route because he wanted to talk and that I was overreacting. He played it off like I was some dramatic girl making a big deal out of nothing. The cops listened to both of us, but there wasn't much evidence, just my word against his. In the end, they let him go with a warning. I was furious, but I wasn't surprised. He was rich, charming when he wanted to be, and he knew how to spin a yarn. The way that he made me feel so powerless, and I started double-checking my locks at night, looking over my shoulder when I walked home. I never saw Alexei again, and I was grateful for that. But the whole thing left a mark. It wasn't just a bad date. It was a reminder of how quickly things can turn, how someone can seem perfect on the outside and still be dangerous. I learned to trust my gut after that, to listen when something feels off, and I never let anyone drive me home again unless I was absolutely sure that I could trust them. My name's Camille, and I'll be honest, my dating history was a mess. I've been on dating apps for a while, swiping through profiles, hoping to find someone different. I always seem to end up with the same kind of guys, though. Mean, rough, and if I'm being honest, sometimes violent. A lot of them were into some pretty edgy stuff, like drug dealing, or they were MMA fighters with egos that were bigger than their biceps, and I was pretty much tired of it at that point. I wanted something better, someone who wasn't like that. So when I matched with this one guy, we'll just call him Tom, I actually felt a spark of hope. And his profile seemed normal. He had a steady job, liked hiking, and didn't come off like he was trying to prove anything. We started chatting, and he was kind and funny even. I told myself this could be a fresh start. We texted for a couple of weeks, and I opened up a bit about my past. Not everything, but enough to let him know that I'd been with some bad guys and was trying to move past that phase of my life. And he didn't judge, which was nice. He listened, asked questions, and seemed to get it. And eventually we decided to meet up. I suggested a place on the outer limits of the city, a quiet little pub that I'd been to once or twice. It wasn't exactly fancy, but it was far enough from my usual haunts that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. Or so I thought. I got to the pub and grabbed a table near the back. Tom showed up right on time, and he looked just like he did in his pictures. Average height, brown hair, very kind eyes. And he smiled when he saw me, and I relaxed a little. We ordered some drinks and started talking, and it was easy, just like our text messages. We talked about his job, my love for old music, and random stuff like favorite places to eat. And it felt good, like maybe I'd finally met someone who wasn't completely toxic. And about an hour in, Tom excused himself to use the toilet. I stayed at the table sipping my drink and feeling pretty hopeful. I was thinking about how maybe this could work, how maybe I could leave my old life behind. But when Tom came back, he seemed a bit off. Not upset, just sort of distracted. I asked if everything was okay, but he brushed it off and said it was nothing. I didn't push him though. We just kept talking, but I could tell that something had definitely shifted. He wasn't as relaxed anymore. I wondered if I'd said something wrong, but I couldn't think of anything. We finished our drinks and decided to call it a night. It was getting late and the pub was starting to empty out. Tom offered to drive me home, which I appreciated. I didn't live too far, but it was nice not to have to take a bus or call a cab. We walked out to his car, parked in a dimly lit lot behind the pub, and the air was chilly and I pulled my jacket even tighter. And that's when I noticed a group of people hanging around near the edge of the lot. They looked pretty rough, skinny, twitchy, like they hadn't slept in days. I knew that look. I'd seen it too many times before. I grabbed Tom's arm and whispered that we should hurry. And he nodded and we picked up the pace. But before we could get to his car, the group started moving towards us. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, and I recognized one of them, a guy named Johnny, and he used to hang around with one of my exes, a dealer who had been bad news from the start. I hadn't seen Johnny in years, but I knew that he was trouble. I didn't say anything to Tom, I just wanted to get out of there. They got to us before we could reach the car, though. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head, started shouting, asking who Tom was and why he was with me. Tom tried to stay calm, saying that we were just leaving, but they weren't having it. They started circling us, and I saw one of them pull out a crowbar. Tom grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the car, but they weren't letting us go that easily. The guy with the crowbar swung at the car, smashing the side mirror. Another one kicked the door, leaving a dent. I screamed, and Tom yelled at them to back off, but that just made them laugh. Tom unlocked his car finally, and we jumped in. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the seatbelt. The group was still banging on the car, shouting, but Tom didn't wait. He started the engine and peeled out of that lot. I remember the tires screeching. I looked back and saw them standing there, still yelling something, but thankfully they didn't follow us. My heart was racing and I could barely breathe. I kept saying that I was sorry, over and over, like it was my fault. Tom didn't say much, just kept his eyes on the road. The drive to my place was quiet, and I felt awful. I knew these guys were probably connected to my past, and I hated that Tom had gotten caught up in that. I kept thinking about how I'd wanted this to be different, how I'd wanted to leave all of that stuff behind, but I guess it followed me anyway. When we got to my flat, I turned to Tom and apologized again. I told him I didn't know those guys would be there and that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He was kind about it, said it wasn't my fault, but I could tell that he was shaken. His car was messed up and he'd just been through something very terrifying because of me. And before I got out of the car, Tom said he'd like to see me again. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could try again, that this was just a bad night. And I smiled and said that I'd like that too. I went inside, still feeling shaky but holding on to a tiny bit of hope. Maybe he meant it. Maybe we could get past this. But a few days later I texted him and he didn't reply. I waited a couple of more days and tried again. Nothing. I checked the app and he'd unmatched me. I realized that he must have deleted my number and it hurt, but I couldn't blame him. That night was a nightmare and I knew it was because of me, because of the mess that I've been trying to escape. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, feeling like I'd ruined my chance at something good. I'd wanted so badly to change, to find someone who wasn't part of that world. But it felt like my past was never going to let me go. I thought about reaching out again, maybe explaining more, but I didn't. I figured he'd made his choice and I had to respect that. And I felt embarrassed, ashamed even, if I should have picked a different place or told him more about my past up front, but it was done. All I could do was try and move forward, keep trying to leave that old life behind, and I told myself that I'd be more careful next time if there was a next time. I just hoped that one day I'd meet someone who could see past the mess and give me a real chance. I'd been looking forward to that date like a kid looking forward to Christmas. When he asked me out, I felt a little flutter in my stomach, and he seemed like a charming old-fashioned gentleman with a warm smile and a way of being that made me feel like he was really listening and not just waiting for his turn to speak. So we'd met through a mutual friend, and after a few texts back and forth, he suggested that we grab dinner and take a walk on the beach. It sounded perfect, like something out of a movie. I spent a while picking out my outfit, which ended up being a simple sundress. Nothing too fancy, but nice enough to feel good about myself. And I was nervous but excited, hoping that this could be a start to something. And the evening started great. We went to this little seafood place near the shore. It was cozy with string lights and the smell of fried shrimp in the air. And we talked about everything. Movies, music, our favorite places to hang out. And he was easy to talk to, and I felt comfortable, like I could be myself. He told stories about growing up, his old dog, and some of the dumb stuff he did as a kid. I laughed a lot, and he seemed to enjoy making me smile. After dinner, we decided to walk along the beach. The sun was setting, and it was kind of painting the sky this orange and pink, and the waves were calm, lapping up at the shore. It felt romantic, like we were in our own little Disney world. We walked side by side, our shoes were off, sand cool between my toes, and I was happy, thinking that maybe this was someone I could really like. We talked about random things at first, how he liked surfing, how I'd always wanted to try it. But then, it seemed like the conversation just sort of shifted. He started talking about his family, his parents mostly, and I listened, interested in learning more about him, and that's when he said it, so casually, like it was no big deal. How sometimes his dad used to hit his mom. And my stomach dropped. I stopped walking for a second, thinking that I must have heard him wrong, but he kept going, saying that it didn't seem to hurt their relationship and that it was just how things were sometimes. Now my heart started racing, and not in a good romantic way. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd grown up in a house where my parents never laid a hand on each other no matter how mad they got, so the idea that a man was hitting a woman, especially for something as small as talking back, made me feel physically sick. And I couldn't stay quiet. I told him I didn't agree, that no real man would ever hit a woman just for speaking her mind. I wasn't trying to start a fight, I just couldn't let that slide, because it felt wrong to nod along like it was okay. I thought he'd maybe explain himself or say that he didn't mean it like that, but his face changed, and his eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. I could tell he was mad, but I didn't expect what came next. Before I knew it, he was yelling about how I was insulting his dad, how I didn't know what I was talking about. I tried to stay calm, to backtrack a little, but he refused to listen to me. And then he grabbed my arm, so hard that it hurt, and I froze. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs couldn't move. He gave me a sharp slap across my face that stung and made my eyes water. I stumbled back, shocked, trying to process what was happening. This guy I'd been laughing with for an hour ago was now hitting me. He didn't stop. He grabbed me again, and I felt another blow, this time to my shoulder from a closed fist. And pain shot through me, and I started to panic. I tried to push him away, but he was stronger. And I was scared, really scared, and all I could think was that I needed to get away. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe just a few seconds, maybe a whole minute, but it felt like forever. My face was throbbing, and my arm hurt where he grabbed me, and I was crying and trying to shield myself when suddenly I heard shouting. Not from him, but from other people. Suddenly there were footsteps in the sand, and a group of strangers appeared out of nowhere. They were yelling at him to stop, pulling him off of me. And I fell to my knees, shaking, trying to catch my breath. There were 3 or 4 of them, I think, and within seconds they were between us and keeping us separate. One of them, a woman, knelt beside me asking if I was okay, and I couldn't answer. I was too shaken up, my mind racing with what had just happened. The guy was yelling at the group, cursing and trying to push past them. I looked up and saw him struggling, his face all twisted with anger. I was terrified he'd come back for me, but the people held him back, telling him to leave. Someone mentioned calling the cops, and that's when he bolted. He ran down the beach, disappearing into the dark. And I just sat there, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of something I'd never make sense of. The woman stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder, telling me that I was safe now. Another guy was on his phone, talking to the police and giving them a description of what had happened. My face hurt, and I could feel a bruise forming on my arm, and I was embarrassed, scared, and angry all at once. And I kept thinking about how fast everything had changed. One minute we were having a great date, and the next he was hitting me. And I felt stupid for not seeing it coming, but for thinking he was a good guy. The woman helped me stand, and I realized that I was still crying. She was kind, telling me it wasn't my fault and that I didn't do anything to deserve this. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me was blaming myself for saying anything about his dad. A couple of police officers showed up a little while later. I was sitting on a bench near the beach, wrapped in a jacket one of the strangers had given me. The officer asked me what happened, and I told him everything, from the dinner to the walk to what he said about his parents. And it was hard to talk about, especially with my face still stinging and my hands were still shaking. They asked for his name, his number, and anything I knew about him, and I gave them what I could, but I didn't know much. We'd literally only just met. And they'd said they'd try to find him, but since he ran off, it might take some time, and I just remember nodding and feeling very numb. The woman who stayed with me offered to drive me home, and I didn't want to be alone, so I accepted. And on the way, I felt betrayed, not just by him, but by my own judgment. I thought that he was someone I could trust. And when I got home, I locked the doors and just sat on my couch, still sitting in my nice dress, staring at the wall. My phone was full of notifications, but I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to talk to anyone. Because that night changed me. I felt less trusting, more guarded, and I kept thinking about his face and how it went from warm and kind to that just cold and angry look so fast. I had bruises for days, reminders of what had happened, but more than the physical pain, it was the shock that stuck with me. I'd gone on a date hoping for something good, and instead I ended up scared and hurt. The police called a few times after that, but they never were able to get in contact with this guy, and I honestly don't know if they ever will. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never look at a first date the same way again. I was 22, just out of college, and working at a little coffee shop downtown. He'd come in a few times, always ordering the same black coffee and flashing his smile that always made my stomach jump. He was cute, tall, and had messy brown hair with this quiet confidence that really wasn't cocky. And when he finally asked me out for dinner, I said yes before he could even finish the sentence. And that Friday night, I spent way too long getting ready. Stephen picked me up at my apartment, and we went to this nice little Italian place. It was perfect, it had dim lights, good pasta, and conversation that flowed like we'd known each other forever. And we talked about music, our favorite movies, and how he was saving up to travel. And after dinner, we weren't ready to call it a night. Stephen suggested hitting a club a few blocks away, and I was all in. I loved dancing, and the idea of getting loose with him sounded pretty fun. And the club was packed, the music was loud, and the lights were flashing in a way that kind of makes you feel like you're in a different world. And we danced for hours, laughing and sipping on some overpriced drinks, and I was having the time of my life, feeling free and maybe even a little reckless in the best kind of way. And that's when we came across Dan. He came right up to us on the dance floor, very charming and very full of cocky confidence. He seemed to be older, maybe in his late 30s, and he had this slicked-back hair and a smile that was probably too perfect. And he introduced himself as Dan, but everyone called him Hot Tub Dan. And I didn't think much of that weird nickname at the time. It sounded kind of quirky, like something you'd hear in a college town. And he told us he was throwing an after-party at his place and invited us to come along. A few other people around us overheard and got excited, and before I knew it, there were maybe 6 or 7 of us piling into Ubers and heading to this Hot Tub Dan's house. And I was excited. The night felt like some kind of adventure, and I wasn't ready for it to end. Stephen seemed a little hesitant, but we just brushed it off. I figured he was just being overly cautious, and I was having too much fun to really overthink anything. being young and naive. Now we pull up to Hot Tub Dan's place and my jaw dropped. It was huge, a modern 2-story house with big windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. It looked like something out of a magazine, and inside it was even more impressive. Everything was sleek and expensive looking, with a massive living room and a bar stocked with every kind of liquor, and sliding glass doors that opened to a backyard with, you guessed it, a hot tub. And the party kicked off fast. Someone cranked up the music and people started pouring some drinks, and Dan was honestly the perfect host, always making sure everyone had a drink in their hand, always smiling and really quick with his jokes. I got caught up in the energy of everything. The hot tub was obviously a big hit. People were jumping in, laughing, splashing around. I didn't get in, but I was honestly just having a blast dancing and chatting with other people. Most of them were around my age, a mix of guys and gals who'd all ended up at Dan's place after the club. And everything seemed nice and the vibe felt carefree, like we were all just chasing a good time. Stephen, though, was acting very differently. He stayed close to me, but he wasn't as into it as I was. He wasn't dancing much, and he kept looking around like he was kind of sizing things up. I noticed him watching Dan a few times, but I really didn't think much of it. I was just too busy with myself, I guess. And at around 2 a.m., I was still going strong, sipping drinks and laughing with some of the girls that I met. And that's when Stephen leaned in and said we should head out. I was surprised. It was late, sure, but the party was still in full swing. I told him I wanted to stay a little longer, but he was firm about it. He said he was tired and didn't feel like sticking around. I was a little annoyed, honestly, and thought that he was being a buzzkill, but he insisted, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of everything, so we called a taxi and left. And the ride home was quiet. I was still riding the high of the night, but Stephen seemed distracted. He didn't say much, just kind of looked out the window. And I figured he was just tired or maybe not as into partying as I was. And when we got to my place, he walked me to my door, gave me a quick hug, and said he'd text me tomorrow. I went to bed, still buzzing from the night, thinking about everything and all the fun that I'd had. It had been such a fun and wild night, and I was already looking forward to telling my friends about it. The next morning, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was the police. And my stomach dropped. They asked if I'd been at a house party the night before, and I said yes, confused. They wanted me to come to the station to answer some questions, and I didn't know what was going on. But I got dressed and went, and my mind was racing the whole way there. Had something happened after we left? Was someone hurt? I had no idea, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something seriously messed up had occurred. At the station, the officers were kind but clearly serious. They sat me down and started asking about the party, stuff like when did I get there, who was I with, and what had I seen. Then and only then did they tell me why they'd called. A girl at the party had been, for lack of better words, intimately assaulted. It happened after Stephen and I left in the early hours of the morning. They didn't give me too many details, but they said it was bad. Dan, the guy who owned the house, was the one who did it. My heart sank as they talked. I thought about how I'd been at that house in that hot tub backyard, laughing and dancing just hours before it happened. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, as it could have been me. They asked if I'd noticed anything off about Dan, anything that stood out. I told them that I hadn't. He seemed charming and friendly, like the kind of guy who just loved throwing parties and socializing. I mentioned how he'd been so welcoming, always making sure everyone was having a good time. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them told me they'd found a lot of evidence at Dan's house. They didn't go into further specifics, but they said he'd recorded things, videos, pictures, stuff he kept on his computer. It made me feel sick. The guy I'd thought was just a fun host was a predator, and I'd been in his house completely clueless. And I left the station feeling shaky. The whole drive home I kept thinking about how close I'd come to something awful. If I'd stayed longer, if I'd gotten in that hot tub, if I had one more drink, any of those things could have put me in danger. And I felt stupid for not seeing it, for thinking the party was just a good time. But more than that, I kept thinking about Stephen. He'd been so insistent about leaving, even when I wanted to stay, and at the time I'd been annoyed, but now realized that he'd probably saved me from something horrible. I texted Steven as soon as I got home, asking if we could talk, and he came over that afternoon and I told him everything the police had said. And he looked pale, like he was just processing all of it too. I asked him why he'd been so set on leaving the party, and he said he didn't know Dan, but something about him felt off. He couldn't explain it exactly. He said it was just a gut feeling based on the way Dan was acting. He was always hovering around the girls, pushing drinks on them and making them feel uneasy. He didn't want to scare me at the time, so he just said he was tired and wanted to go. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I hugged him and thanked him. I don't know if he realized how much he'd done for me that night, so I was sure to let him know. In the weeks that followed, I kept up with the news about Dan, and it turned out his real name wasn't even Dan. It was like Chris or something, and Hot Tub Dan was just what people called him. The police found a ton of evidence on his computer, videos he'd taken of girls at his parties, some of them unaware they were even being recorded. It was disgusting. He'd been doing this for years, throwing these big parties, luring people in and then taking advantage of them. The girl from our night wasn't the first. I felt so angry, but also so helpless. I kept thinking about her, wondering if she was okay and hoping that she had people to actually support her. Dan, or Chris, eventually went to trial a few months later. I wasn't called as a witness, but I followed the case online, and the evidence was just overwhelming, especially the stuff on his hard drive. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It felt like justice, but it didn't erase what had happened, and I couldn't stop thinking about how lucky I'd been and how one decision had actually kept me safe. And after that, I saw Steven a lot. We started hanging out more and he became someone I trusted completely. I don't know if it was the intensity of that night or just how easy it was to be around him, but we obviously grew close. And I told him one day how grateful I was for what he'd done. He just sort of shrugged and said he was glad that we left when we did. That's Steven though, quiet, steady, and always looking out for me. And looking back, that night was kind of just a blur of fun and danger, a mix of naive excitement and a close call I'll never forget. I still love a good night out, obviously, but I'm more careful now. I trust my instincts and the people who have good ones. That night could have changed my life in the worst possible way, but thanks to Steven, it didn't. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also now have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below if you want to check it out. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if you find yourself in the cheese caves, be sure to delete my taxes. I grew up in the Kentish countryside in the 1980s, and I had this mate called Gordon who was properly obsessed with the army and all that stuff, and ever since I could remember, he had been a military nut. He was the type of kid who played with little plastic army men, collected action dolls, and spent his pocket money at the wartime memorabilia shop in town. He had Airfix model kits of 1,000 different tanks and planes that he meticulously glued together and paint. And I tried to make a couple of kits one time and just got glue everywhere, and my paint applications would have made a Warhammer fan weep. Gordon's grandpa Derek was a World War II veteran. He lived alone in a little ground floor flat, and Gordon and I would often go visit the old man on a weekend. He was a genuinely lovely fella. Imagine the classic loving grandpa archetype, and that was basically him. My parents and Gordon's parents were friends, and my nan and granddad were friends with Gordon's grandpa Derek, and so it was never considered strange that Gordon would bring his friends over to visit Grandpa Derek, especially me. Now don't worry, this doesn't end with Grandpa Derek being outed as some nunce or anything. He was a lovely man, right up until his death in a nursing home in the 90s. Alzheimer's is a real bummer. Now, the issue you see was with Gordon. It was pretty obvious, even to me as a kid, that Grandpa Derek didn't really like talking about his time in World War II. He especially didn't like how excitable and bloodthirsty Gordon would get when he asked his grandpa repeatedly about those he'd killed. I'm sure Grandpa Derek had lots of thoughts about his grandson's idolization of the war, but he was a loving grandpa who didn't want to upset a little kid, so he just smiled and told whatever stories his PTSD would allow. When the event I'm going to talk about happened, Gordon and I were maybe 10. It was a Saturday, and we'd been to visit Grandpa Derek along with our third friend, Eugene. Eugene wasn't one of Gordon's preferred friends. He kind of tagged along with us and complained about everything, and I understood why Gordon didn't like him, but I did. Gordon was in the mood with me that day for letting Eugene hang out with us, but after we'd visited Grandpa Derek, he kind of perked up. I had no idea why, but I knew that it had something to do with the fact that he disappeared off into the storage room in Grandpa Derek's flat while we were there. After Grandpa Derek's, Gordon led us out into the woods to play. We had a sort of tree fort thing that we were building there that summer, and this was the first time showing Eugene. Eugene whined and moaned all the way through the undergrowth, of course, complaining about brambles and thorns and branches and midges and pine cones. When we got there and he saw our cool fort, Eugene got excited and we played soldiers for a bit. Of course it was soldiers. Gordon only ever wanted to play soldiers, rampaging through the forest with stick guns, pretending to kill each other in a myriad of gruesome ways. And after a while, Gordon called us over and asked if we wanted to see something cool. Of course we did. So he grabbed his backpack, reached into it, and produced 2 items that forever changed my life. One was a gun, which I would later discover was a Luger P08, and the other was a grenade. There were always stories in the news about kids finding live grenades in fields or things like that, and we'd even have an assembly about it when a guy had found one near us. Even if we hadn't, though, I would have recognized what it was because Gordon was so obsessed with war and weaponry, so I also immediately recognized the fact that it was missing the pin. I was concerned that this meant that the grenade was live and dangerous. Eugene wasn't just concerned. In that moment, he was petrified. He pointed at the grenade and actually shrieked at Gordon that it was going to explode at any moment, and that Gordon had no idea how dangerous that thing was that he held. He could kill all of us with it. And I'll never forget the smile that crept over Gordon's face. "I know," he said. Eugene and I looked at each other, exchanging a silent agreement not to make any sudden moves. Gordon carefully tucked the pistol into his jacket pocket and gripped the grenade. "If I press this lever, it'll blow us all up," he said. Now, being the voice of reason, I told him, maybe don't do that, and Eugene just yelled something else. Gordon was looking wistful, talking about how if we blew up, we'd be heroes, dying heroically in battle, he said. I pointed out that it's only a battle if there's an enemy, that it would just be us dying in a stupid accident. Eugene was starting to get frantic, and I could see him glancing over his shoulder like he was getting ready to run. I was genuinely terrified that if he did, Gordon would throw the grenade and just blow us all up. "Please, Gordon," I said. And Gordon gripped the grenade tighter, and now he was talking about honoring his grandpa Derek's fight. What? I thought. This kid was mental. And I told him as much, and Gordon just stared at me and stepped forward menacingly. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the grenade out of his hand and flung it, and then I braced myself for impact. Silence. We all stood there frozen for a moment, and then Gordon started laughing like a maniac. "It was a model! It's fake!" I stared at him, absolutely astounded and speechless. The whole thing had been a prank. Serious, po-faced Gordon had pretended that he was going to kill us all as a prank. That was awesome. I started laughing too. Eugene didn't really see the funny side, but even he was keeping his calm. I think we were both just relieved that our friend wasn't actually mental and we weren't going to die. I shoved Gordon in the shoulder, kind of just good-naturedly, and he laughed and sort of stumbled backwards. Something fell from his jacket pocket, and I heard the clunk of metal, then a loud, echoing bang that made my ears immediately ring. Gordon's face went white. Eugene crumpled to the ground, almost in slow motion. I turned to look at him, mouth agape. I could see a bloody wound on his forehead. When I had shoved Gordon, the pistol he'd stolen from his grandfather, Derek, had fallen out of his jacket pocket and hit a rock. And as I said, we later found out it was a Luger P08. Grandpa Derek had kept it ever since the war. He thought it was unloaded and non-functional, so he said anyway, but it turned out it must have just been jammed or hadn't been used in a while. Hitting the rock caused it to discharge, and the angle that it fell meant that it shot Eugene right square in the middle of his forehead. And shockingly, Eugene was fine. The wound looked nasty, but in actual fact, the bullet had grazed him and ricocheted off the hard, bony part of his forehead. It turns out it can actually be quite hard to lethally shoot someone in the head, but nevertheless, Eugene was incredibly lucky here. It also turned him into the coolest boy in school, a reputation he maintained from then on. And we're still friends to this day, old geezers ourselves now, I guess, and Gene often jokes that being shot in the head as a kid was the best thing that ever happened to him. Grandpa Derek managed to avoid any real trouble for owning that gun. This was quite a while before UK gun laws became a lot stricter, so he got away with a bit of a telling off from the Rosers and his daughter, Gordon's mom. Gordon was in the absolute doghouse, though. His parents made him get rid of all of his military models and toys, and they banned us from visiting Grandpa Derek without adult supervision, mostly for Grandpa Derek's protection, really. Thankfully, things ended up okay, and Gordon grew up to become normal, a well-rounded adult. And the incident and the punishment absolutely put him off any and all interest in the military, though, and the kid who always insisted that he was going to grow up to be a soldier ended up as a manager at Sainsbury's. Gene and I still keep in touch with him, and Gene takes great delight in never letting Gordon live down the time that he shot him in the head. The worst friend I ever had was a kid called William. I was kind of forced to be his friend, and we were put together at kindergarten because our moms were friends, and William decided that I was going to be his. I don't mean his friend, I mean his. You see, in his eyes, he owned me. I was a walking, talking, living, breathing toy for William's amusement. And what I mean by that is his favorite game was making me cry. We were like 5, and already William knew a dozen ways to pinch, prod, poke, and stab me. And his bullying never got noticed. He was the type who'd reach under the table and pinch you on the soft flesh of your thigh or flick the back of your ear with a rubber band. Because of William, I got a reputation as a crybaby, prone to bursting into tears over nothing. And I was too scared of William to tell anyone that he was actually hurting me pretty consistently. Sometimes at recess, he'd make me go behind the school and choke me with my t-shirt collar until I puked. Other times, he would do this burn on my arm, and it felt like the skin was going to split. He pulled my hair out, he'd just prod me with these pins that he had, and I was known as the clumsy kid who was always breaking his toys or tearing his clothes or tripping and crying. But no, looking back, it was always William. I wish there was a twist that I could add here. And William was my imaginary friend, but he was very real. And this very real, very unpleasant torment continued throughout elementary school. There had been one blissful moment where William's family decided to move away because his stepdad got a promotion, but then that fell through and I was stuck with my bully and tormentor, and it seemed like it would last forever. The wildest part is that William also seemed to actually like me and enjoyed spending time with me. Over the years, he'd made sure that I had no other friends, so Back then, I guess I thought this kind of friendship was normal. Looking back now, it fills me with terror, but back then I genuinely thought William was my friend, and I convinced myself I enjoyed spending time with him in return. I'd invite him over to play most weekends, even though it would inevitably lead to my things getting broken or William somehow getting in trouble with my parents. Occasionally, we would play at William's house. His family was a lot richer than mine. William had a dog, an older sister, and a Nintendo. William would never let me play the Nintendo, but he'd let me watch, always promising that I could get the next turn until inevitably we ran out of time. Another thing William had was bunk beds. This meant on the rare occasion we had a sleepover, it was usually at William's house. Somehow my childish mind would allow itself to be afraid of William at night, so I never wanted to sleep over at his, but occasionally I had no choice because my parents were going away or something. My mom and William's mom were friends, like I said, so William's house was always the first choice if I had to stay overnight somewhere. We were 8 and 9 when this happened. I was the older of us by just a few months, and it was the middle of the night. When I slept over, William let me take that top bunk, and this seemed really exciting to me as someone who didn't have a bunk bed. But later I realized it was because William always slept on the bottom bunk because he was afraid of heights. I woke up to William tugging on my arm. He made me get out of bed and threw water in my face to wake me up. This was typical William fashion. And next he told me we were going to the park. I knew we weren't supposed to go out in the middle of the night, especially not alone at that age, but I really couldn't say no to him. I didn't even have to say anything. He was already reaching to pinch me if I started to protest. Now this was around May, and it was warm out. I didn't mind too much that William made me wear my pajamas to the park even though he'd been allowed to dress, and at least he let me wear shoes. At the park near William's house, there was a really tall jungle gym that William never let us play on because he said it was gay. That night, though, it was the focus of his attention. "Climb to the top," he commanded me. Now I should point out that this was a children's park in the 90s, so there was minimal lighting, and there was one lamp that made things barely visible, but nowhere near enough light to let us play safely on the equipment at night. William didn't care, though. He wanted me to climb to the top of that jungle gym, and by God, was he going to make me do it. Thankfully, I was a pretty agile kid, and the thought of climbing to the top didn't really bother me, even in the dark. Now I climbed up the netting and onto the top bars, knowing it was far easier than facing William's anger. And when I was at the top, William told me to do a handstand. Now, I say I was agile, but I wasn't Spider-Man. William could hurt me as much as he wanted to. I couldn't do something I couldn't do. He knew it, I guess, because when I said no, he just shrugged and turned away. I lost sight of him in that darkness. And then, something hit me in the head. Hard. Pain and light flashed before my eyes and I stumbled backwards, which of course meant that I fell 12 feet to the ground. I slammed into the ground and just felt myself, for lack of a better words, break. I have no idea how else to describe it. It was like a sudden, sharp, cracking ping through my body, and then nothing. I could taste copper though, and smell it too. I could feel a wetness around my cheek. Was I crying already? No. I was bleeding from what I'd later discover was a serious skull fracture. I tried crying out for help, but there was no sound coming out of my mouth. I just let out a few wet gasps. I couldn't even move my head or turn to look. And I heard William walking over to me though, and then he sat down facing me. Why wasn't he getting help? And he proceeds to say, "See? This is what happens when you don't do what I say." Then my supposed best friend in the world went off on some rant about how I always needed to obey him because it would keep me safe. That if I'd just done a handstand, I wouldn't have fallen off the climbing equipment. I remember him rocking back and forth a little as he talked, like he was just in complete shock. And at first I hoped that was the case, but the more he talked, the more I realized that he was just excited to see me broken, bleeding, and, as far as I knew at that time, dying. And that's when the pain kicked in. This sort of white hotness throughout my whole body, so bad that I can't even recall how it felt if I tried. I remember feeling relief too, If my legs hurt so much, then I couldn't be paralyzed, right? I still couldn't move, though. Not at all. I was starting to swim in and out of consciousness. Meanwhile, William, 8 years old, let me remind you, kept lecturing me about how this was my fault, how I brought this on myself. And in that moment, I finally realized that William might actually, genuinely let me die. And nearly a whole hour later, that's how long William waited before going to get help, and I actually believe that he was hoping that I'd die so he somehow wouldn't get in trouble. But he didn't. He had no choice but to go and wake his mom and stepdad. I barely remember the paramedics finally getting there, or the trip to the hospital, or the immediate recovery. What I do remember is the relief that people believed me as soon as I told them everything. It all came out. This years of bullying and torment and torture, how William had forced me to climb up that jungle gym and then throw a rock at my head. The rock had hit me square in the temple and was consistent with that projectile, and I later found out that the doctors had already told my parents that it looked like someone had thrown a rock at me, so I guess they already suspected my friend. I'd suffered a broken arm, 2 broken legs, multiple fractured ribs and vertebrae. I required numerous surgeries and still kind of walk with a limp almost decades later. William's family was responsible for all my medical bills, and still I think my family would have given that kid the death penalty on top of it if they could have. He didn't get sent to juvie or anything, but his mom and stepdad sent him away to some kind of long-term behavioral camp for troubled kids, and apparently he was the youngest kid ever to get sent there. A few years later, William wrote me an apology letter. I didn't even want to read it. My parents let me throw it on a bonfire, and I'm forever grateful to them that they didn't force me to accept his apology, because refusing to do so was an incredibly healing experience for me. I could have never believed his apology was genuine, not after having to lie there bleeding out on the ground as he lectured me about how my fall was my own fault. Now, I don't know what became of William, and I don't want to know. This is the first time I've talked about the experience in years, and to me, the best revenge on William is to treat him as an insignificant footnote. But, William, if by some chance you're also a Let's Read listener and you hear this, then I want you to know, you almost killed me. I was in college in 2007, and I had a buddy, we'll just call him Kieran. Now, I'd known Kieran since middle school, and he'd always been a bit of a weirdo. He also had to be alternative, but in a way that felt very forced, like he was being different for the sake of being rebellious and different. Like he'd get into metal and emo bands, but as soon as any of us liked them, then he'd call them crap. He had a raging hate boner for Metallica, who he saw as the biggest sellouts of all time, and he'd do weird performative stuff like buying Metallica posters just to tear them up. He had this story that he'd tell about buying a Metallica CD and wiping his butt with it. It was pretty stupid, right? Except he'd use this story to try to impress chicks, as if they'd find it sexy that this smelly metal kid with an infected eyebrow piercing had smeared feces on a Metallica CD. Like I said, he was an odd duck. I can't really explain why I stuck with Kieran. I guess it was more like he stuck to me and I didn't have the energy or drive to get him away from me. He was just there through middle school, high school, and then he was part of my group of loyal slackers who went to college in our hometown. And because of this, most of our little group either lived at home or, in the case of a few of the guys, in a shared 3-bedroom apartment that had extremely questionable hygiene. This was known as Andy's apartment, even though Andy just rented it with 2 others. We were stoners and metalheads and slackers, but I like to think that we were all good guys and gals. Kieran didn't really live anywhere exactly. He had loving, supportive parents, but chose to couch surf, crashing on someone's floor or my basement couch. He'd spend weeks at a time sleeping in the bathroom of Andy's apartment until one of them would get sick of him and kick him out. Then he'd do the rounds staying with me or one of the other guys until he was back begging Andy for room and board. This all began when Kieran showed up at my place one night, sliding through the basement window at around 11. He had a method of getting the window open even when it was locked and would occasionally show up and help himself to my snacks or weed even if I wasn't home, and it drove me nuts. Thankfully, this night I was home, chilling and playing some Doom on my PC, which I had finally upgraded enough to run that damn game. Kieran flopped onto my couch, dropped his ratty old bag onto the floor, and told me that he was going to be staying with me for a few days. Okay then. He lit up a bong and sat there smoking it for a while before asking me if I was into occult stuff. I said I'd never really thought about it. Despite being a die-hard metalhead with an interest in horror, I'd never really considered myself into the occult. I was, and am, a Christian, which I reminded Kieran of then, and he responded by doing this weird demonic cackle, like he was trying to act possessed but obviously wasn't. And then he made some absolutely cringe statement about how he was allergic to Christianity, which was odd because he'd never had a problem with my faith or even commented on it before. "Check out this book," he said, or something like that, and I paused my game and turned around to look at him because I was so baffled by his cringelord behavior. The God Delusion had just gotten really popular the previous Christmas, so I figured that he was going to tell me about that. And instead, he was waving around a copy of the Satanic Bible, and it looked like a library copy. Kieran had, he told me, gotten heavily into magic and rituals and crap. According to him, the Satanic Bible was filled with spells and mystical rites that let you summon all sorts of demons. I mean, it isn't, and even back then I knew that, but I couldn't be bothered to argue with him. Next, he pulled out this collected works of H.P. Lovecraft titled The Necronomicon. He told me it was the genuine Book of the Dead and contained dark and terrible secrets. Okay, clearly he hasn't even read it. And he kept going on, showing me a bunch of books, clearly ones that he'd stolen from the library, mostly fiction, and I carried on pretending to be interested but paying no attention, and I thought nothing more of it until maybe a few days later. I was walking through the park at the center of town. It was a huge park that connected to the college and the local high school, so you'd often see high schoolers and college students hanging out in their various groups. You'd rarely see the two together though, so I was surprised when I saw Kieran sitting with a group of goth emo-looking high school students. Our eyes met, and he gave me a kind of angry look and a little shake of his head, like, "Don't come over here, bro." Now I was curious though, so I leaned against a tree, just pretending to study a textbook. Kieran was talking to the high schoolers, most of whom were girls, about how he could do magic. He knew how to summon demons. He's done successful rituals many times, he said. Typical Kieran bullcrap. And then the conversation took a darker turn. He started telling them how he could grant wishes, as long as the wishmaker engaged in blood sex magic with him. He was waving his freaking satanic Bible around and heavily implying that he could help. Obvious garbage that nobody would fall for, right? So you're probably already seeing the problem. These kids look like sophomores at best. Kai, one of the girls, was a freshman, the kid's sister of a buddy of mine called Jonas. She was 14, maybe 15, and Kieran was 22, and she was the one he was directing his attention at. I watched them a bit longer. Very dumb of me, but as much as Kieran annoyed me, I wasn't ready to throw away a long-term friendship over this without trying to reason with him. On top of that, the rest of the gang was overly forgiving towards Kieran and would rarely accept anything bad about him. And as I was watching, a couple of my buddies from college called me over and we got caught up in conversation very briefly. And when I looked back, Kieran and Kai were gone. I asked one of the boys where the older emo guy who had been hanging around had gone, and they told me that he'd gone with Kai to the store. I knew the store Kai had probably gone to, so I jogged over there. Kai was standing outside looking around awkwardly, and casually I asked her if Kieran was with her. She acted suspicious and very cagey, and I thought that she wasn't going to answer. Then the bell over the door rang, and Kieran came walking out, holding plastic bags filled with what I could tell was 2 six-packs of beer. And he looked at me, very guiltily, and mumbled something about seeing me later. In no way was I leaving Kai with Kieran. Kai was looking uncomfortable and awkward and kept glancing at the beer. I could tell Kieran had bought it for her. And I asked them where they planned on going, and he told me they were heading to Andy's apartment. And I told Kai that I didn't think her brother Jonas would be cool with her hanging out with Kieran, and Kai looked like she was about to cry. Kieran suddenly got in my face, pulling me to one side and hissing at me to not ruin this for him. I pointed out that Kai was like 14 and buying her alcohol was messed up, on top of God knows what else he had planned. He assured me it was nothing, and Kai did as well. If they were going to Andy's apartment, I didn't figure that the others would let Kieran get up to anything weird there. They might have been forgiving of him, but they wouldn't let him take advantage of an underage girl. Unfortunately, I had practice and I had to leave them. I hated that fact, but called up Andy, who I trusted with my life, and explained that situation to him. I told him where Kieran and Kai were and to make sure that they did end up going to his place, and then asked him not to let anything happen to Kai. Fast forward to that evening, I got home, grabbed a bite to eat, showered, and then headed downstairs to the basement with a towel around my waist. Kieran was sitting in the middle of the floor, a book open in front of him. Next to the book was one of those huge plastic slushy soda cups that you get from the convenience store. Kieran was bare-chested and looked to be covered in blood, and he was holding a long, thin knife. I asked him what the hell was up and what he was doing here, and his face was all battered, bloodied, and swollen. He forced the words out, explaining how the guys had just turned on him and that they were all dead. At first I panicked, thinking that Kieran meant that they were literally dead, and then he kept going on ranting about how they'd all get what was coming to them, etc. Kieran drew blood and started smearing it on the book. I have no idea to this day what kind of ritual he thought he was performing or why he decided to act like this. I'd also like to stress up front that his state of mind was the product of being drunk and high, not some kind of serious mental illness, at least I think. And of course I didn't know this at the time, but I do now, and I wouldn't be sharing the story if Kieran was a victim in all of this. Now, since Kieran was holding a knife, I decided not to approach him for now, and instead retrieved my cell phone. I had a bunch of missed calls from Andy and even a couple from Jonas, which didn't surprise me. I called Andy back and he explained that Kieran had brought Kai over and tried to get her drunk. And then right in the living room, he started trying to persuade her to do more intimate things with him in exchange for quote-unquote magical blessings. Of course, they weren't having any of this, but Kieran became very belligerent. The guys called Jonas to come get his sister out of trouble, and when Jonas turned up and found his drunk, stoned 14-year-old sister with Kieran, all he saw was red. After being beaten up, Andy said Kieran had fled, and I explained that he was in my basement doing blood rituals. And after laughing their ass off, Andy'd offered to come help, and so that's how Andy and I spent the evening wrestling some drunk, stoned, bloody Kieran out through my house and hurling him unceremoniously onto the lawn. We told him in no uncertain terms that he was no longer welcome around any of us, and if we even heard that he'd been trying to hook up with those high schoolers again, we'd make him wish that he'd never been born. And then Andy helped me add a new, strong latch to the basement window. Kieran became something of an infamous figure around town over the next 15 years. Thankfully, I never had to deal with him again outside of some evil looks, but he went on to become the town creep, basically. All sorts of dark rumors swirling around him, but they're mainly of the predatory, creepy, loser weirdo kind. And thankfully, he never succeeded in his attempts at blood magic or seducing high school girls. I finished high school a few years ago, just before COVID hit. In my senior year, though, my buddy James became a major weirdo after getting heavily into anime. Now listen, I'm not trying to generalize here. I'm into all that kind of stuff as well. I loved Dragon Ball Z as a kid, and I've kept up with a few animes over the years like Bleach, Tokyo Ghoul, Attack on Titan, etc. I love Akira and Ghost in the Shell as much as the next man, and Spirited Away is my favorite movie of all time. And I'm not here to dunk on James for liking anime. The problem is the kind of anime he became obsessed with and how it changed him as a person. I think you can probably guess the type. I won't go into details. It happened after he broke his leg just before summer break leading into our senior year. He was immobile, so he spent the whole summer just shut away in his room, watching anime and posting about it online. At first, I thought it was great. I was the one who'd tried to get him into a few shows previously, but then his tweets and Facebook posts got weirder and weirder. And like I said, I won't go into details and give examples, you just can imagine the kind of weird waifu types of posts, just strange and a bit perverted. Now, he's always been kind of a milady, nice guy type, but harmless with it. He was a bit of a goofball, just a sort of silly, fun guy. And after that summer, though, he was downright odd. He'd also gotten some kind of job working online, so between a lack of going out and an increase in disposable income, he'd developed the means to start a particular collection. I first saw it when I got back from a European vacation with my family. I'd been on vacation for just over 3 weeks, so I hadn't seen James in that time. I dropped by his house to check in on him, and it turned out to be the day that he'd had his cast removed. He was back on his feet, so to speak. James led me up to his room and proudly displayed his brand new wall of shelves, filled with anime figurines. They weren't normal anime figurines, no. They were all girls, and most of them were in various states of undress. James told me that the collection was displayed in order of when he'd first bought them, and I could see a noticeable uptick in explicit imagery as I went down the shelves. It started out with just girls, then girls in bikinis, and then girls wearing less than bikinis, and then girls engaging in, well, acts. James was like super proud of his collection, and I almost thought he was trolling me, if not for the fact that he clearly spent thousands of dollars on these plastic girls. It made for the most painfully awkward, uncomfortable afternoon. If you've never spent a few hours with a guy talking you through all the plastic toy girls he owns, while the girls in question gaze at you lustfully, then I severely don't recommend it. It was a big yikes. School started back up after summer break, and I was kind of dreading seeing James again after following his social media posts and seeing his collection. I hadn't exactly been one of the cool kids in the first place, but I'd seen some of the replies James had been getting from our friends and classmates, and I knew that they were laughing at him, not only behind his back, but straight to his face. James had been my best bud for the 3 years that we'd been in high school together. There was no way that I wouldn't end up seen as uncool by association. It would have been different, and I felt like I could stand up for him or justify his weirdness, but nude anime chicks, come on, man, at least keep it to yourself. And sure enough, when school started again, James was just talking about anime and waifus and crap like that nonstop. And looking back, I should have told him to go pound sand much earlier than I did, but I was too nice for my own damn good. Or too lazy, I don't know. Thankfully, James wasn't my only friend, so I started hanging out with Peter and Trent more often, messing around on our skateboards or hanging out in the quad. Strength in numbers meant that even though James was around, I wasn't too tarnished by his weird anime girl persona. And then the transfer student showed up. Her name was Hai. She was a Korean American, and of course James was immediately hopelessly smitten by her. He was a sad loser though, so of course the idea of just introducing himself to her and being normal never occurred to him. Instead, he got this idea from some anime he'd watched that the way to Hai's heart was leaving notes from a mysterious admirer in her locker. This lasted for 3 notes when Hai caught him slipping the 3rd note into her locker. The way Hai reacted sealed her doom though. You see, it turns out that Hai was one of the nicest, kindest, sweetest people ever put on God's green earth, and so her natural reaction to James' unrequited love was to let him down gently by telling him she wasn't looking to date anyone right now. She followed this by trying to be a good friend to him. On one hand, I wasn't complaining because it meant that one of the prettiest girls I'd ever seen was hanging out around me. On the other hand, it meant that James would not stop harassing her and hitting on her. He was just gross, always making suggestive comments, always leering at her, being real vulgar and awful, and I just kind of smiled and took it. Meanwhile, she and I were getting close. I'm not sure whether James had worked this out already, but he started showing us photos of his anime girl figurine collection. He'd constantly buy new figures and thrust his phone in our face, showing weird photographs of his silly little statues. And Hai was very polite about it, but it made her more and more uncomfortable until one day, she broke down in tears in my car and told me just how awful James was making her feel. That's when she showed me the DMs. It turns out James had been privately messaging her with his fantasies about her and being his waifu. To this day, I'm not sure that he knew or even cared that she was Korean, not Japanese. Again, not giving examples, but it was vile. And of course, it made my blood boil extra hot because I was really starting to actually fall for this girl. Now, next day at school, I told James in no uncertain terms to back off and leave Hi the frick alone. Amazingly, that worked for about a week. And then, all the madness started. Explicit images were stuck all over Hi's locker. She found an open condom in her bag. Someone wrote a slur on my locker. Someone keyed my car. Crudely photoshopped images of Hi's face stuck on these H girls that we found around school. And, of course, it was James. He managed to avoid me directly for a few days, and then one day he came storming towards us in the quad, and he started ranting, yelling, crying even about how Hi had broken his heart and ruined him. Then he grabbed her. James grabbed Hi, pulled her towards him into an embrace, and according to him, accidentally groped her chest. She screamed. I screamed. Then I was on James, punching and pummeling and pounding him, feeling his face under my fists, all my rage and disgust at him just pouring out. I was suspended for about a month while the school administration pieced things together. Thankfully, there was security footage and witness testimony that James had grabbed Hi and groped her. I very narrowly avoided expulsion and a criminal record. Thankfully, everyone was so disgusted with James, even his family, that I got off lightly. I absolutely do not recommend solving your problems by punching them repeatedly in the face. I regret what I did, but not because I feel bad for James. James pretty much got away with assaulting Hi, and she wouldn't press charges because she was concerned that it would get me in worse trouble. Honestly, she was probably right. But I hated that creepy anime James basically got away with it and had nothing more than a bruised face and a deservedly damaged reputation. At least he eventually transferred schools, and via some Facebook stalking, I had the satisfaction of knowing that he didn't graduate that year and actually had to repeat his senior year. I know the story would be a lot scarier from Hi's perspective, but, and I kid you not, she feels bad for talking smack about James. So she asked me to send this in from my perspective instead. And in case you're wondering, Hi and I are still together 6 years later, and as for James, we can only guess. I had a friend in high school who very nearly ruined my life. Their name was Leo, and they were smart. Genius level smart. Too smart for his own good, really, which is why I got bored and did things to amuse himself. I hadn't really known him coming up through middle school and most of high school. I was kind of an average, normal kid who was decently okay at school and decently good at football and baseball. Most of my buddies were more jock types, and Leo was a quiet, smart kid who I always just figured was a band geek or a theater kid. Well, he was certainly theatrical anyway. One day in junior year, he just walked up to me, introduced himself, and told me that he was going to become my new best pal. I was kind of amused by this, and I'm a pretty easygoing and placid fella, so I sort of say, sure, why not? From then on, we spent the next year just hanging out, playing video games, going to the mall, fishing, just normal stuff that kids in the 2010s would do. I grew to really like this Leo guy, and he was a bit strange and mysterious, but it didn't really bother me. We'd never hang out at his house, and I never met his family or knew anything about them. He told me he had a younger brother who died, but I later found out that wasn't even true. He had an older sister who was alive. And that was the first weird thing about Leo. Almost everything he told me during the few months that we were friends was some lie. Just completely made up, but in a meaningless way. He told me he lived in one part of town. It turned out to be another. Not for any possible reason either, it just was a part of him amusing himself, I guess. I have no way of knowing exactly the extent of how many lies he told me in that time, but knowing what I know, I'm pretty sure everything he said had a degree of untruth to it. And like I said, Leo would get bored and do kind of insane things just to amuse himself. When all of this was over, he confessed to me that, at first, he wanted to see if he could befriend someone and sustain acting like a completely different person to them. Why? Well, he would just say that he was bored. And if this was the extent of it, then it would be a pretty creepy and pointless but ultimately harmless thing. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. I discovered the following through hindsight, so bear in mind that I didn't know any of this was happening at the time. His project was to steal something from my house every time he visited. It was always something meaningless that we wouldn't notice was gone or wouldn't assume had been stolen. A bottle of bleach, a ceramic banana, a small ornament for my Gram's bedroom. My grandma lived with us when I was a high schooler. A pill from a prescription bottle. Various other things I forget because they were so insignificant. I only know about it because Leo presented them all to me one day. You'll see. His penultimate game was to convince me to be afraid of him. We were in senior year by this point, and he did this by repeatedly dropping hints that he was a serial killer. I didn't work out what some of this meant at the time. He'd tell me that he enjoyed hurting a neighborhood cat, or casually let slip that he'd been following a woman in the dark. And then he started referring to his trophies, and when I asked about them, he became coy and mysterious. And this is when I kind of stopped enjoying hanging out with Leo. I gradually started to drift away from him, and we went on with our lives. Then his final game began. One day I was minding my own business, happily working away in math class when I get called to the office. I had no idea why, of course, so my first thought was something bad had happened at home. This made me anxious and a bit jumpy, which really didn't help, and when I got there, the principal and her secretary were waiting for me, along with a member of the security team. They told me they needed to search my bag and my locker, and to this day I have no idea if they were really allowed to do this, but I had no reason to deny them. First, I emptied out my school bag. Nothing weird to note here, just some books and a pair of gym socks. I remember the principal and the security guard giving each other an odd look. I didn't even think to ask what was going on. I was still generally shell-shocked. Next, they marched me to my locker. They opened it up and searched through everything and again found nothing. And now I finally asked what was up. Sternly, the principal told me that they'd received reports from multiple students about me. Apparently, I'd been talking about a hit list and had confided in a few kids that I had a locker full of firearms at school. Now, of course, all of this was nonsense, and the accusations made me freak out. I broke down in tears there in the hallway. I guess my reaction was so severe that they believed me because the secretary even took me back to the office and made me some tea. I asked who'd accused me because they must be trying to frame me for some reason. The secretary stressed that she couldn't tell me anything, but that it had come from multiple students. And I was so confused. Again, let me remind you that I had no idea about Leo's games at this point. At most, I just thought that he was an unsettling weirdo. A week or so later, I got an apology from the school. They were pretty brash about it, but they said that after further investigation, it turned out that the accusation against me was not credible, and that the students themselves had been misled and thought that they were helping. This last part, in particular, made me extra suspicious and curious, but I was so relieved not to be under suspicion that I just let everything drop. I only found out the truth of everything after graduation. I just started college away in a different state. I had no idea where Leo had gone away to college, and I didn't care to know. I'd always suspected he had something to do with the accusations against me. I'm sure he deliberately waited until we'd gone our separate ways and he couldn't be traced before emailing him. And like I said before, I was a placid and easygoing kid, but I think I would have kicked the crap out of Leo over this if I'd been able to. I got an email. He sent it to my private college email address, of course, just to flex to show that he could track me down, I'm sure. And that's when he told me the truth about everything, or what I'm supposed to believe is the truth anyway. All the random, meaningless lies he told me compared to what the truth actually was. A whole bunch of things that were just utterly meaningless. And next, he revealed all the things that he'd stolen from my house. He took in a photograph of all the items. It had a copy of that day's newspaper in the picture, too. Another pathetic little flex, I guess. I'm sure he thought it made him seem cool and sinister that he kept all those items. To me, it just seemed pathetic. The idea of him transporting all this crap to his new life away at college just felt so sad to me. And then he went on and on about the serial killer stuff, how he'd been trying to scare me and hoped it had worked. And I guess it sort of had, now. And then finally he explained how he managed to convince a bunch of students I was going to do something terrible at school. how he'd managed to work things so that nobody knew the rumors came from him, and everybody involved genuinely thought that they were doing good by reporting me. Then he made sure to add that it was also his doing when I'd been found innocent, because he didn't want me to suffer from being falsely accused. He just wanted me to know that he could. And when I think about it, that's true. It could have been so much worse. If someone sets their mind to ruining you, there's a good chance that they can do some degree, especially when you're a kid and can't necessarily work out how to fight back. If Leo had wanted to make things a lot worse for me back then, he probably could have, because he was literally bored. And that's why I decided not to even reply to his email. Let him get it out of his system and forget me. And I never did hear from him again. It's been quite a few years now, but anytime something goes wrong for me, I have to wonder. Anytime something happens that I can't explain, my first thoughts go to Leo. Is he back? Is he screwing with me again? Has he thought of another game? I have no idea what became of Leo since he last emailed me, but I hope he's occupied. I really don't want to find out what happens if he ever gets bored enough to remember me again. So just a quick story that I wanted to send to you. I wanted to tell you about an absolutely terrifying encounter I had with a now very much ex-friend of mine. This was a few years ago when I was living in Brighton in the United Kingdom. I had this mate, we'll call him Ken. And like me, Ken was part of Brighton's thriving LGBTQIP2SAA+ scene. Whereas I'm a pansexual woman, Ken was a very flamboyantly gay man. Despite being pansexual, I'm nearly always only attracted to guys, so Ken and I would have many nights out in the pole, gossiping over dudes, pulling hotties, and all sorts of good times. He was quite the giggle, but for 2 years of our friendship, I would have told you that Ken didn't have a bad bone in his body. But boy, was I bloody wrong. That Friday evening, Ken dropped by for some pre-drinks before we were going to hit the nightlife. It was peak summer, and a big party was going down in Brighton Beach, hosted by a local radio station. Me and Ken were sipping daiquiris and talking about something, probably BGT or Strictly or some show we used to watch back then. And that's when I casually mentioned that I was meeting up with a new Tinder date at the party that night. And Ken sort of froze and looked really weird. I asked him what was up, and he launched into a rant about meeting strangers on the internet. Now bear in mind, this wasn't too long ago, so it was way after online dating apps had become totally normal. And I laughed and told him that he sounded like my old nan, and not to be such a worrywart. Ken wouldn't let it go, though. He just kept going on and on about it, how it was a bad idea to meet a guy from Tinder, and I'd regret it. I laughed, and maybe snapped at him a little because I was really excited for this date, and why should Ken be panicking now? I'd met guys on Tinder before, and he'd met people on a bunch of apps. I was doing my lippy in the mirror when I saw Ken come up behind me. He grabbed me from behind in a chokehold, his arm locked around my neck. He started hissing something about how strange men can easily overpower me, and there would be nothing I could do. I started to laugh nervously and try to wiggle away from Ken's grasp. He would not let go, and in fact, his arm tightened around my neck. I could barely breathe. My vision was starting to blur at that moment. "Get the F off of me," I shrieked, and tried jerking away from him. I elbowed him in the side, and I guess I did it harder than I meant to because I actually felt a faint crack from his ribs. Ken absolutely lost it. He slammed me forward, smashing my face into the mirror, which shattered with the blow. The next thing I know, I'm on the floor. Blood was pouring into my eyes, and Ken's on top of me, punching me in the face and neck. I'm screaming, howling, slapping at Ken, scratching at his face, and I felt one of my teeth break, and I spat blood and a tooth at Ken. And that must have somehow snapped him out of it because he jumped up off of me and started screaming in terror. And then he frantically was moving about the room like something was after him, and I'd never been so scared in my entire life. Suddenly he calmed down out of nowhere, sat on the sofa, and just started sobbing quietly to himself. Well, it turns out that afternoon Ken had done a bit of a certain white powder, but I guess it was laced with God knows what and caused a bit of a temporary psychotic break. My face, tooth, and well-being took the brunt of it, I guess, and I found this out later. At that point, obviously I called the law and got Ken taken away, and then I went to the hospital, got checked out, treated, and stayed with friends. Obviously, I realized something had gone seriously wrong with Ken and he wasn't behaving normally. I'd found out what had likely happened through some friends of mine who'd bought from the same dealer as Ken and had been told that the drugs had been contaminated. I decided to drop any charges against him if he paid for my tooth replacement and then kept the hell away from me. And yes, Ken didn't mean to go that far, but it was his choice to partake in the nose candy, and he still had that kind of violence deep within him. While I don't hold any hatred in my heart for him, I simply couldn't ever feel comfortable around him again, and I severely hope that wherever he is now, he isn't endangering anyone else. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, or you can hear all the stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, we're all going to eat you, Roki. Hey, Jolo. I'm an English lad who used to be well into camping when I was a teen. Me and some buds used to go onto the moors whenever we got the chance, and we just pile into Chegger's car on a Friday night and F off into the middle of nowhere with some tents and some bevies, some disposable barbecues, and more meat than we knew what to do with. We got into camping and orienteering when we did the Duke of Edinburgh stuff in school, which is basically a series of challenges relating to wilderness survival and community stuff. One of our mates, Milo, had gotten so into it that he'd effed off to join the army, but the rest of us just kept the tradition up during holidays from uni. We weren't all sporty guys or anything like that. Well, some of us weren't. Powell was, and he was a proper mad rugby lad doing a sports science degree. But then there was Cheggers, who was teased for being a proper nerd because he'd studied engineering, even though he was the one with a decent car and the de facto leader of the group. And then there was Brody, Sammy, and me studying physics, English lit, and drama respectively. Yeah, I'm a theater kid, I'll admit it. I was a bit of a rowdy twat back then too, though, so were all of us. We were well aware of it, and we wanted to be seen as polite, sensitive boys. That's why we like to go out in the absolute middle of nowhere, and all the mud and cow crap and English pea souper mornings, and just let loose. That's what we always did. It's what we got up to on our first night that summer, and what we planned to do for the next 6 nights when we were all back in town for our second-year summer break. So imagine our surprise when we all woke up with stinking hangovers that one Saturday morning, rolled out of our respective tents, and were faced with an old hippie-looking couple pitching their tent in the adjacent clearing to ours. We'd found this isolated forest a year ago and had come here a few times since. We made a semi-permanent fire pit out of bricks, and there had never been any indication that anyone else had used it besides us. Quickly sobering up and warning Powell to behave nicely, we strolled over to the older couple to introduce ourselves and ask if they wanted any help setting up. Most of us were pretentious little scroats back then and considered ourselves very world-wise and cultured, so we quite liked the idea of camping next to an old hippie couple who probably had good stories to tell and hopefully some weed if we were lucky. You could smell that they smoked, though. The lady looked to be in her 60s. She was thin, gaunt really, with frizzy hair and a kind of manic smile. She had these huge, thick glasses that made her eyes look almost comical, and I immediately found her adorable. The guy was big, built like a brick outhouse, and he had the biggest, bushiest beard I'd ever seen in my life. He wore that old green army jacket that every young guy in the UK seemed to own in the 2000s, but he was much older, and the jacket didn't fit him well. He also wore this fascinating weird hat that was covered in badges, pins, fishing flies, all manner of stuff really, and it was like a punk's school backpack but on his head, and it was the hat that first jogged my memory. "Hey, are you Mr. Hamrodden?" I blurted out after some small talk. "Used to be an art teacher." He said he was. He smoothed the beard down and I could see it. When he taught me art in secondary school, he'd been completely clean-shaven. He'd been my favorite art teacher in years 7, 8, 9, and 10, but then he'd left the school halfway through my GCSE years and I never knew why. It kind of sucked because the new art teacher we got after him was a battle axe who had very strong, strict opinions about what art had to be, and I was glad to ditch her for my A-level art course. Cheggers and Sammy had been in my art class in years 7 to 9 as well, so they were made up to recognize Mr. Hamrodden. Not his actual name, by the way, just very similar. You can probably guess it, but I don't want to get sued. Now, Brody vaguely remembered him too, even though he'd never had classes with Hamrodden. I looked around for Pal, but saw that he went off into the woods and was disappearing among the trees. Hamrodden introduced the woman that he was with as his partner, Sainsbury's. This is actually what she called herself, like the supermarket. No idea if it was her real name. They had some Sainsbury's bags with them, so I always figured that they'd just taken the name from that. I just didn't see how it could matter at the time, and I thought they were trying to be funny. You don't really suspect that old people were up to no good, especially old beloved teachers. Utterly dumb, I guess, but hey, I'll happily admit to being an idiot when I was a teen in the 2000s. We helped Hamrodden and Sainsbury set up their tent. They told us that they'd parked in the same car park that we were in and that they'd seen Cheggers' car. We asked them how they knew about our little hidden forest spot and whether they had been here before. They said they had, many times, and had made use of our fire pit, which they were grateful for. Like I said, we'd never seen any indication that anyone had used it, but it's not like we went over it with Batman Arkham Asylum detective vision. We shared some lunch with a couple, then went our separate ways to go on a hike. Powell was nowhere to be seen, which wasn't super unusual. He'd sometimes go off hiking by himself. And looking at it now, I think Powell is neurodivergent in some way, because he needs these periods of alone time every now and then, and when we were kids, he'd often just disappear without telling anyone. Needless to say, we don't think anything of it when we didn't see Powell all afternoon. He wasn't back at the tent when we returned from the hike either, but Hamrodden and Sainsbury were, and we ended up hanging out with them all night, listening to music on Brody's battery-powered stereo, drinking some beers, and then frying up some steaks on the camp stove. Hamrodden regaled us all with stories about his time as a teacher, his time as a hippie in the swinging 60s, and his time in the army of all things, and then his recent life as a touring camper with his girlfriend. Sainsbury kept relatively quiet, chipping in every now and then about her vegan lifestyle, joking about the meat we were eating and stuff, although not in a judgy, unpleasant way. Hamrodden chowed down on some steak, and I noticed that they didn't contribute any food or drink all night, but I still had hope that they'd share the weed that I knew they had. And as the sun was setting, Hamrodden brought out a selection of baggies from his pocket. Brody and Sam had passed out drunk by this point and crawled into their tents. Powell still wasn't back, and I was beginning to get a little concerned. Cheggers said it was fine, though. He even had a mobile phone reception, so he managed to fire off a few texts to Powell. And there was nothing to do but wait, so I turned my attention back to my old art teacher. I'd expected him to have some weed, and he did, but there was more than that. A strip of what looked to be LSD tabs, a bag of pills, and a huge bag of mushrooms. Hamrodden claimed that they'd picked the mushrooms that afternoon on their hike, but that obviously wasn't true. They'd been meticulously dried out and packaged, and I knew from experience that drying out magic mushrooms of any kind takes ages. Cheggers was down for a joint, but he really had to persuade Hamrodden to share. It was like they didn't want to waste anything on him. On the other hand, both Hamrodden and Sainsbury were really keen to get me to drop a tab of acid. When I absolutely point-blank refused, they offered me a pill. I'd always imagined pills to be the go-to drug for ravers and 20-somethings on lads' holidays, not aging hippies in their 60s. Probably prejudice, but hey. Either way, I wasn't buying what they were selling, no matter how much they insisted it was free, no strings attached. I smoked part of a joint, just so I could let Cheggers have some, then they started to go on about mushroom tea. I didn't really have any say in the matter, I guess. They were already boiling up the water in our kettle over our camp stove, and chucked a whole handful of the mushrooms in. I asked if they were sure the shrooms were safe, and I remember even though the haze of a pot and beer, I felt a very sobering chill when Hanrodden waved my question away and vaguely said, "I guess so." After they brewed the tea, Cheggers snatched up a cup before the couple could protest and downed it. I didn't think he'd ever done shrooms before, so I was a little worried. And sure enough, he very quickly stood up and began to wander around the woods. I get a nagging panic in the back of my mind that I needed to take care of my friends. Cheggers was stumbling around hallucinating gnomes, and Sammy and Brody were passed out, and Powell was God knows where. Unfortunately, I was forced to primarily focus on myself. Hanrodden and Sainsbury were trying to force a huge mug of mushroom tea onto me in between more attempts to get me to drop a tab. It was all getting a bit much for me, and I felt the fear build up in my chest. I was pretty stoned and regretting my decisions immensely. The cold chill of paranoia gripped the back of my head, and I started puking into a pile of leaves. Sainsbury came over to me and put her thin arm around my shoulder. She led me back to the campfire and Hanrodden held up a cup to my lips and tried to feed me that mushroom tea. I pretended to drink, closing my mouth to the lid, then smacking my lips like it was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted. Puking had caused me to start sobering up. Cheggers was frolicking through the trees, trying to catch a gnome or a fairy or some such thing that he was yelling about. My vision was blurred and confused, and panic was starting to grip me. I felt Sainsbury rubbing my shoulders, and then Mr. Hanrodden doing the same. He was talking about a commune in the 60s or something, free love and nudism. He asked me if I wanted to take my clothes off, and I said no. And both their hands were all over me, prodding and poking and groping. They tried to put a pill in my mouth and I spat it out, shouting at them. Nearby, Cheggers let out some whoop of joy and then collapsed into a heap on the forest floor. And to this day, I have no idea how much of what I saw was panic and how much was a skunk-induced hallucination. The weed I'd smoke had to be laced with something. There's no way that the residue of the mushroom tea against my lips would have caused any hallucinations. I don't think. Hanrodden took on the appearance of the devil, a demonic face glaring from his huge beard. Sainsbury was a crowing harpy, and the forest around us was filled with laughing, shadowy figures, and Hanrodden was telling me that everything would be better if I just gave in and took my clothes off with him. Then he started doing things to himself. Even as a 19-year-old, it made me sick to see an adult old man doing that toward me, and I began to scramble away, blinking frantically to clear my mind of the fog and confusion they'd forced on me with the drugs and booze. And then I heard it, a visceral, furious bellow from the forest. For a moment I thought it was Bigfoot, or a werewolf, or a mountain man, and then my mind cleared, and I saw my mate Powell charging through the trees, swinging a great big stick as he ran. He hooted at Hanrodden, telling him to get off me and leave me alone. Then he swung the huge branch he held and crushed Hanrodden's tent in one smash. That guy was scrambling away from Powell, dragging Sainsbury with him. Powell ran to me and held a can of Coke to my lips. He had me drink and then slapped my cheeks gently. The sugar and the shock helped me sober up a bit more, and I joined Powell in screaming at that old art teacher, who was struggling to pull up his pants as he scrambled along the forest floor. Powell advanced on the elderly couple, swinging his tree branch, and I watched them exchange words. Powell grabbed Hanrodden by the collar and shook him, shouting and spitting into the old man's face. I could vaguely understand why, but everything still seemed like a chaotic nightmare. My head was spinning, my heart was pounding, and I watched as Powell escorted Hanrodden and Sainsbury into the trees and away. And slowly, I passed out. I woke up in the tent as the sun was rising, and crawling out I came face to face with two very hungover friends, Sammy and Brody. Pal was there too, fresh-faced and rested. He hadn't taken anything the night before, so for once in our lives, Pal was actually the designated sober guy. And he explained that he had chased off those weirdos and made sure that they'd gotten into their car and left. At first I freaked out, forgetting the events of the night and thinking Pal had forced them to drive drunk and stoned. But then things came back to me. It also struck me that not once had I actually seen Hanrondon himself smoke or drink, and it seemed like he'd just been intent on me getting absolutely messed up. Eventually, Cheggers got up too, and after being sick as a dog in the woods, we all had some coffee and a long chat. And Pal told us everything. After we recognized that art teacher, he'd stalked off because years ago, in year 7, he had a horrific experience with the teacher and never told anyone. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, Pal said, and he wouldn't give us any real details, but here's what happened. Pal had been a slow developer and had special classes in years 7 and 8 for kids who were behind. For some reason, this involved a weekend trip to a farm, and Hanrondon was one of the other teachers chaperoning it. According to Pal, that guy had walked in on him in the showers every single night on the trip and continued to make creepy remarks to him after they'd returned to school. Pal said that he didn't think it was enough to tell anyone about it, which we sort of chastised him for that. But when he realized that the old guy we met was Hanrondon, he saw red and had to go for a hike to cool off. He also said that he couldn't prove this, but he'd heard that that guy had left our school when he did because there had been some other accusations aimed at him regarding his behavior towards some of the kids. I have since looked into this and verified that this is in fact likely true, although nothing was ever proven in court. I'd love to name and shame this guy. He's still alive even today from what I can gather, albeit an ancient man. And I hope he suffers crippling arthritis every day. What a creep. I never could actually uncover who Sainsbury was or what her story was, and I was a little miffed at Pal for leaving us with a guy he suspected of being dangerous. But we were all grown adults, even if only just, and Pal was the only one who eventually came and saved us all after all. But yeah, that's the story of how my former art teacher drugged and groomed me. Kinda put a damper on the camping trips, and I can't help but wish that Pal had cracked that dirty old man a proper one with his tree branch. It's truly what he deserved. So in the early 2010s, my buddy and I, my buddy being Sean, used to go camping in the Sierra Nevada. We'd usually pitch up a tent somewhere near Mount Whitney or go hiking around Lake Tahoe, but we went all over the area. We were both native Californians, and our beloved mountain range was our absolute favorite place to spend time when we needed a break from the rat race. One time, we settled on a spot we'd never explored before. It was a fairly remote site off the beaten track, and we couldn't find any evidence that it had ever been camped at. Exactly the kind of spot Sean and I'd like to check out and document. I was a bit of a journaling nerd, and at the time I think I was using LiveJournal or Tumblr to post sincere, intensely purple travel and nature writing. Now, I wish I still had an archive of most of it. It was incredibly abominable, but I had so much fun doing it, and that's the main thing. Sean was more of a photographer, and he still is, and basically spent most of our trips with a camera glued to his eye. Never ever suggest to that man that he use a cell phone for photography, though. He'll get a rant about how it's sacrilegious to use a camera thinner than a DVD case. Me, I'm happy to snap pics with my Samsung. And back then I wrote everything down in notebooks, and Sean would capture it on his Nikon or whatever expensive piece of equipment he was using at the time. He'd been entering some online photography competitions, which is why he was stoked when he found this pristine camping spot that none of the Sierra Nevada forums we'd frequented had ever mentioned. We set up a tent and spent the night beside a bunch of trees, and we cooked up some burgers on our little stove there and then settled in for the night. And everything passed without incident, and we awoke refreshed the next day, ready to explore the area. The area where we camped was segmented by a small river. We followed the water upstream through the outcrops to the base of a small mountain. Sean paused to photograph what he insisted was a golden eagle flying overhead, and a bit later we spied a mountain lion prowling across some rocks, thankfully in the far distance on a different mountain. Now eventually we broke for lunch in the shade of a cliff face. I scrawled some notes in my journal while Sean snapped some more pics, and he disappeared behind some rocks, and then I heard him calling to me pretty excitedly. Now stopping my writing, I headed over. Sean had found a cave. Something about the gaping dark opening in the rock gave me the creeps though, and I suggested that maybe we should move on. The area is home to some black bears and various other things like mountain lions obviously, and this could have easily have been their lair. Sean said that he wanted to get a few photographs of the cavern entrance, and we were both armed and had bear spray and all that good stuff, so it didn't seem too risky. We stepped into the opening and almost immediately we were swallowed by the darkness. It was eerie. It felt like we'd stepped into liquid shadows. Behind us, the sun beat down, but inside the cave, it was pitch black. I snapped my flashlight on, warning Sean not to take any flash photography just in case it startled anything that might be lurking in the cave. The cavern seemed to descend deep into the rock. I stepped forward, curiosity getting the better of me, and something crunched under my foot. I looked down. It was some kind of bone, the leg of a deer or cow or something. I felt Sean's hand grab my arm, and he whispered something and nudged my flashlight upward. There was movement deep in the cave, and I tensed, trying to decide if I should reach for my gun when Sean spoke again. "It's a person," he said. A shadow darted across the beam of the flashlight. It did look like someone was up ahead. A humanoid shadow flashed across the wall for a split second, and I was sure that I saw some pale flesh in the beam. I called out. "Hello?" My voice echoed through the dark cave. Sean was whispering that we should hightail it out of there, and I knew he was right, but the explorer in me was winning out. I was curious. There are all sorts of rumors about mountain folk living in the Sierra Nevada. My uncle used to tell one story about a family that he'd known that were so poor that they lost their house to the bank and had to go live in a cave. He told it to me as a cautionary tale, a reason to be thankful for what I had, but I'd always found something romantic and fascinating about the idea of impoverished folk living in a cave in the mountains. I dreamed of it as a kid, and now there was a chance that I could meet someone who actually lived here. It was fascinating. Then Sean brought me crashing back to earth with, "Dude, don't be a moron," and began dragging me forcefully by the arm out of the hole in the rock. I called out one last time, "Hello?" "Get!" echoed back. "Get gone!" Then a string of curse words I won't force you to read for your YouTube monetization reasons. It certainly didn't sound like some feral mountain man. In fact, it sounded very much like the junkies I'd seen panhandling on the Strip or on any low-income street you'd care to walk down. And at that moment, my illusion was shattered. We ran out of the cave, tails between our legs, and decided that was enough exploration for one day. Time to head back to our tent. And by the time we did, it was mid-afternoon, and I was looking forward to kicking back and getting some writing done. Nothing doing, though, because when we reached the tent, we were met with a completely terrifying sight. Our tent was covered in blood. At least that's how it looked at first in our momentary freak-out panic. We've been talking about mountain men and cave-dwelling junkies for the entire walk back, so I'm not surprised that we jumped to conclusions. But when your tent is covered in red liquid, what do you assume? Now up close, it was much clearer that it was some type of paint. Someone had tossed a can of red paint all over the outside of our tent. Thankfully, we hadn't left anything important behind, but the tent itself was clearly ruined. More paint had been splashed into the interior, soiling the sleeping bags too, and there was even the word "leave" having been written in paint across the canvas. And at that moment, of course, we did. It was a couple of hours hike to the car, and we had no shelter and nowhere to sleep, so there was nothing to do but drive to the nearest town and get a motel for the night. We hung out in a bar just down from the motel and got talking to the bartender. We told him about our close encounter with that feral mountain man, and he just laughed. Apparently that area was home to a gang of meth cooks, and their junkie clients would often camp out or hang around the mountainside. He said it was surprising we only bumped into one of them. There's normally a few trailers dotted around that area, meth heads letting off guns and all sorts of stuff. I still don't know to this day if he was actually screwing with us, but he seemed amused and surprised that we'd escaped that encounter intact. According to him, there was a shooting around there almost every week. Sean and I decided not to go camping off that beaten path after that. We still went exploring for many years after, but we stuck to places that weren't home to murderous meth addicts or feral cave dwellers. About 6 years ago now, I was dating a girl who I'll just call Julia. I'd been with her for about 8 months when the story took place. We had, so I thought, a pretty normal, happy, healthy relationship. We did all the things a young couple does. We lived and worked in the same town, we met on OkCupid, and we had a few dates and then got serious. After 8 months, we hadn't moved in together, although I'd been thinking of asking her. Julia always talked about how she liked her independence, though, and I didn't want to make the mistake I'd made in my last relationship of coming on too strong or moving too fast. Instead of living together, we would take regular vacations together. They were usually long weekend getaways, either to visit my folks or shopping trips. One time, we did a tour of a few theme parks over the course of some weekends, and it was great, and we became the couple that vacationed together. I thought everything was going perfectly. Like I said, I was thinking of asking her to move in, and maybe down the line popping the question. To my knowledge, our relationship was solid as a mountain. And I'm sure that since I'm saying all of this, you've already worked out that it wasn't. Instead, it became a source of crushing fear for me in a way that I could have never have predicted. We'd never been camping before. We didn't want to have to spend too long on the road, so the nearby state of Rhode Island seemed like a perfect destination. It has a number of fantastic campgrounds, and we picked the one that looked the most appealing. Something not too isolated, but not too busy either, and fairly near the coast where we plan to spend the second half of our 2-week vacation in an Airbnb. It was early fall, and Rhode Island is stunning at that time of the year. The drive down took maybe 8 hours, including a couple of stops, and as we passed into the forested countryside in the heart of New England, Julia couldn't stop talking about the natural beauty around us. And in that moment, my heart swelled with love and excitement at spending 2 weeks in beautiful Charleston with Julia. The campsite was beautiful. We picked a quiet time to come, so there weren't that many other campers around, and our spot was gloriously isolated, tucked away on the very outskirts of the camping area with a forest right next to our site, and a beautiful little pond twinkling in the afternoon sun just a short distance away. I think I remember using the words idyllic to Julia in a very breathless voice. It was pretty cringe looking back, not because I was wowed by nature, but, well, you'll see. The first night went by fast and wonderfully. We cooked up some wieners over the campfire, spent some quality time in the tent, and then went for a late-night hike through the forest and grounds, ending beside the pond where we sat and took in the moonlight off the water. And I just sat with my arm around my girlfriend, and I genuinely thought that life was perfect. The next morning, I realized that I couldn't have been more wrong. I woke up to the sound of Julia yelling. Even at the time, I remember getting this weird feeling about it, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I scrambled to pull some clothes on and then dashed out into the clearing. Our stuff was trashed, and it looked like this rampaging group of hogs had just come crashing through the campsite, although there was no way that could be the case. I wasn't the heaviest sleeper, and I hadn't woken up until Julia screamed. And I looked around in dismay. Our cooler of food which we'd left sealed in the car, was completely smashed everywhere. There are only a small number of black bears in Rhode Island and none remotely close to this family commercial campsite. Burgers, sausages, mac and cheese, and all sorts of stuff lay scattered about the camp, like some kind of high school food fight gone wrong. A case of beers had been punctured and thrown around the grounds, and the whole place just stank of that old yeasty alcohol. And then it struck me that if the cooler from the car was smashed, that meant... And then I turned up to look. And of course, the back windshield of the car was smashed, and that's seemingly how they'd gotten the cooler out. Not only that, my beautiful new BMW had these terrible gouges and scratches in the paintwork on one side, and I literally almost wept when I saw that. Honestly, that car was my baby. Julia was yelling frantically. She told me they'd smashed our phones and gestured to a pile of shattered glass and electronics at the base of a large tree. And she was right. Both my phone and hers were completely destroyed. Something about this piqued my curiosity, though, but I was too shocked and dismayed at the whole scenario to really think much about it. There was just this nagging, unpleasant feeling about the phones. Finally, Julia pointed to the forest nearby where some of her clothes, which had been in a case in the car, were thrown over the bushes. In particular, a few of her underwear were on prominent display. Julia immediately and forcefully began telling me her theory about what had happened. A group of guys, probably frat bros, had come rampaging through our camp at night, drunk out of their minds. They'd decided to screw with us and terrify us. And Julia had, she insisted, seen the group of frat bros camping on the other side of the campsite when we'd first arrived the day before. I asked if she'd actually seen them invade our camp, and she was very cagey about this, said that she thought so, but it was dark and she couldn't be sure. I let it drop for now and then began cleaning up the campsite. Julia helped. As we tossed the food and retrieved her clothes, I said that it was a bummer our camping trip had been cut short. And Julia shocked me then by looking horrified, grabbing my hands, and begging if we could stay. I questioned this. Why on earth would we stay when our things had just been trashed, the car had been vandalized, and worse, these people could still be at the campsite? Now, we called the cops, of course, and a ranger came to see us a few hours later. He said there really wasn't much that could be done, apparently, which seemed like bullcrap to me. And he promised to ask around the camp anyway and told us to keep an eye out to be safe. I asked him if he thought we should move along, and he was pretty dismissive that it was just kids. Kids who'd cost me a bunch of food bills and vehicle repairs and phone repairs. And after the ranger left, Julia pointed out that there was a store on the other side of the campgrounds, that we could just buy a tarp for that back windshield, and that it could be fixed on the second part of our vacation on the coast. There was no sense in canceling everything on day 2 just because of some chaos like this. Now, in the moment, I told her that was okay, we'd see how it went. I was distracted, still kind of seething with fury over what had been done to my car, and also trying to pin down the nagging concern I had in the back of my mind, as all of this, for as insane as it was, obviously didn't feel right. And later that day, after a lot of affection from Julia, I started to calm down. We went for a walk to the camp store to recoup some supplies. I didn't tell Julia, but I was also keeping an eye out for vandal frat boys that she alleged to have invaded our camp. I couldn't really see any group of guys that really matched that description by Julia, and I couldn't decide whether this was a relief or kind of strange. I did see the ranger chatting to a few folks, though, and he sent me a little wave, as if to say, "Yep, I'm doing my job," so I guess that made me feel safe. Now, when we were in the camp store, Julia and I got into the dumbest argument. I don't even remember what it was about, but I do remember it surprised me how much she lost her crap. I think I jokingly disagreed with her about what kind of wieners to get, and she just flipped, yelling at me that I never listened to her or took her opinions into consideration. And this was the first time I'd ever heard about this, and I guess I got defensive. Not an excuse, but I was still mad and upset about the car, and also a little frustrated at Julia for wanting to stay at the campground where we'd been the victims of an actual crime. And Julia stormed off, leaving me to finish up the groceries and pay the bill. I did so, and then I wandered outside to look for her. There was no sign of my girlfriend, but I did see a small group of guys who could possibly maybe be the frat bros if you squinted. And they seemed like chill, nice guys, but I approached them anyway and asked if they'd seen any other suspicious characters around their age camping in the park. They told me they'd been there for a few days already and hadn't seen anyone under the age of 40 other than myself and Julia. And that checked out for my observations too. Then, one of them came up to me and quietly asked if I was okay. I figured the stress of the day must have been in my face or something, so I explained that our car and campsite had been vandalized. This seemed to shock the kid, so I asked him why he checked in with me. He told me the woman I was with seemed, and he paused here, saying, volatile and angry. I figured he must have seen Julia stomping away after our argument, but it all seemed pretty strange. When I got back to the campsite, everything was incredibly quiet except for this faint sobbing coming from our tent. I dropped the groceries on the picnic table and ran over there. Julia was sitting in the tent, and tears were streaming down her eyes, rocking back and forth. I went to her and put my arm around her. Eventually, I got her to calm down, and she told me what had happened. She returned to our tent after our argument, and 3 guys had showed up. She said they threatened her and made some lewd advances toward her, and then when she rejected them, one of them had kicked a dent in the door of the car. I wanted to go out and check as soon as I knew Julia was unharmed. But consoling Julia was more important, and I started asking her questions about the guys so we could tell the cops. What did they look like? What race were they, etc.? And Julia started yelling at me, saying I was inconsiderate and thoughtless. I hadn't even asked her if she wanted to get the cops involved, and she didn't actually. She wanted to just drop it, and how dare I grill her about the details. And she started asking me if I thought she was a liar, etc. Now I'm completely shocked and taken aback. I hadn't been entertaining thoughts like that at all. I had wanted to know so we could identify them, obviously, and now that Julia had freaked out so badly, though, again, a suspicion began nagging at me. It did seem like Julia was hiding something. What if they'd assaulted her worse than she'd let on? And that's where my mind went first. But man, was I naive. That night, I was adamant I wanted to leave. There sure was a dent in my car door, and the whole vacation had been completely tainted and overshadowed by this stupid series of terrible assaults. And Julia was over-the-top enthusiastic, though. And she went absolutely out of her way to try insisting that we were having a great time, that it didn't matter if we were being targeted by harassers, that we'd be just letting them win if we gave in and rolled over. And honestly, I said I was happy to let them win if it meant safety and a harassment-free weekend, and this made Julia mad again. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of the attacks, but as we sat in silence around the campfire, both of us were just kind of sulking after yet another argument, I realized what had been bothering me the whole time. Without even thinking, I brought it up to Julia. How had the vandals smashed our phones when we'd gone to sleep with our phones in the tent the night before? They hadn't been charging in the car. We'd both fallen asleep watching YouTube and some reels, and Julia opened her mouth, closed it again, opened it, and then closed it. She stared at me, and if looks could kill, I swear I'd be a dead man. Then she began to scream at me. She asked me where I got off accusing her and what I was trying to imply. I hadn't accused her of anything. I just asked how the vandals got a hold of our cells when they were in the tent. I hadn't mentioned her at all. And at this point, the red flags were impossible to ignore, and it was obvious that Julia was involved somehow. I'm sure it's been obvious to everyone that Julia was behind the vandalism, and you probably think I'm an idiot for not suspecting her right away. In my defense, it's easier to make it look that way when I'm telling the story in retrospect, and I'm not some professional storyteller or master of tension, so I've probably given away the fact that Julia was the culprit right at the start. But sure enough, that's the conclusion I started suspecting at this point. And as gently as I could, since she was behaving so volatile and erratic, I asked my loving girlfriend if there was anything she wanted to tell me, and if she knew something about the vandalism. That's when she broke down and confessed everything. She was convinced that I no longer loved her. I was going to break up with her on this vacation, and I'd been planning to for months. She thought I was cheating on her. She thought I cared more about my new car than her, and I guess that's why she did so much damage to the car in particular. Now please let me stress that there was absolutely no truth to any of these claims. Even in the aftermath, a few of our friends decided to believe Julia and low-key suspected me of having done something to trigger her behavior. And I can swear to the Lord above that I didn't. I did not so much as look at another woman in that way, and I genuinely thought Julia was the one. And that night, around the campfire, she told me that she thought that I would start to love her again if I thought we were in danger, that my male protector instincts would kick in and I'd go back to caring about her like I used to. I was speechless, furious at first and then sort of just sad. The love of my life was clearly having some kind of mental breakdown, and I had no idea what to do about it. The first thing I did was pack up the car. No way were we staying on a vacation under this cloud, and Julia begged me to stay one more night and check us into a hotel, but I couldn't. We began the drive home that same evening, and let me tell you, that was the most awkward, silent road trip of my entire life. My plan was to get Julia home and then work out the next steps, maybe get her medical help or therapy. I didn't expect this to be the end of our relationship, but yeah. I have no idea what happened to Julia, and I wish I could have helped her. I took her back to her apartment in the early hours of the morning and told her we'd talk the next day. I woke up to find that she'd blocked me on everything: social media, Facebook, email, my phone number, and then I started getting messages from friends asking why I treated her so poorly. And things escalated from there, and I eventually had no choice but to just make a clean break. I cut Julia out of my life. I cut most of our mutual friends out, and eventually I moved away to a completely different state. Nearly a decade later, I still occasionally get threatening messages from random accounts calling me a cheater, a rat. One time in a city far from anywhere I'd ever been with Julia, my car got vandalized again, and it was probably a completely coincidental piece of bad luck, but it's hard not to be paranoid. I have no idea if Julia ever got help or got better, and it breaks my heart to think about it. I'm married now to a beautiful woman who is pregnant with my child, and I managed to suppress that paranoia. I spent a lot of our early relationship convinced that she was going to suddenly turn on me. It hasn't happened yet, and maybe I was an oblivious idiot though, but I never saw any signs of it with Julia either. Everything was perfect, and then our first camping trip seemingly broke her. Maybe I'm just superstitious, but anytime my current wife brings up the idea of camping, all I can say is absolutely not. When I was a much younger guy, I did a lot of stupid things to try to impress a girl, most of which I don't really want to get into right now, but maybe the most reckless one that I'm willing to admit to was I agreed to protest a fracking development in a small village in Sussex. I didn't know what I was getting myself into when Amy, the girl that I was into, took me to buy camping gear. I thought we were just going to make some noise and wave some placards, not spend the night there. She was telling me about how important this was, and I tried to look like I understand. The next morning, about 100 of us pitched our tents by the side of the road, ready to block any traffic into the drilling site. Someone had rigged up a PA and was playing Black Sabbath, and every time a car passed through the road, we ran out to block it and chanted our slogans. As one passed, I tried to get enough signal on my phone to text my mom that I wouldn't be back that night. Later in the day, when everyone had eaten all the snacks they brought, one legend had brought a whole barbecue and enough burgers and sausages to share, almost evenly cooked, and we all went back to our tents. We got there a bit too late to get the best spots, so ended up a bit further back than the rest of them, but I didn't think that would matter. As we both got to our tents, in the camping shop I jokingly suggested it would be cheaper to get one big one, or at least after she said no, I said it was a joke. Amy pulled out a cooler and offered me a cider. I'd hoped I'd done enough to make her think I was boyfriend material, I'd even shown her how to put the guy ropes in, which she'd had to move. We were woken up a few hours later by the owner of the tiniest edge of land we'd inadvertently been camping on. In my sleepy state, I couldn't make out a word he was saying, but the moonlight made clear enough the shotgun he was waving at us. He looked very angry, and I assumed he was saying something along the lines of "get off my land." We had just about enough time to run out of our tents before he could shoot at us. The farmer began screaming and hollering, and I have honestly never been more afraid. I only had my underwear on, and luckily Amy had been sleeping in a Spider-Man t-shirt, which, in different circumstances, well, looking back, I'd have just grilled her about comic book trivia, so I'd only have embarrassed myself. In our panic, we didn't run towards other camping protesters in safety, or at least numbers, but in the other direction. The road we'd been protesting on was between two villages, and I knew that there was no chance we'd make it to the next one before the farmer caught up with us. In this darkness, we could easily get lost if we went off the road, but so could he, so this seemed like the best option. I tried to get Amy's attention, and then grabbed her hand and ran into the woods, hoping she'd run with me, which she did. It was at this point I regretted having seen the Blair Witch Project recently. The woods quickly became dense enough that we had to give up holding hands, so I had no idea how far away she was. I hoped that she was still near me, but in the almost total darkness, I could barely see her or anything. A few times I nearly ran into a massive oak tree. It might have been the same one. And once I tripped on a root, feeling my knees smash into the earth before I could reflexively put my hands out to brace myself. I must have lost Amy a while ago, but I couldn't even be sure when. I was also very lost myself and not sure how far I'd be able to run now. I considered just lying there to wait in the cold and dark for the morning light to come. And then I heard a cry. It was Amy. Imagining the farmer with a shotgun and the trouble Amy could be in, I ran towards where I thought I'd heard the sound. I think I must have hurt myself a few more times in tree branches or something, because the next morning I had a lot more cuts and bruises. I managed to catch up with Amy, but so had the farmer. I suppose as a gesture of politeness, he wasn't pointing his shotgun directly at me, which I assumed he probably would if it was me he'd found. But it was still a threat. He hadn't noticed me yet, but I didn't really want to hurt him when, out of the three of us, he'd probably had the best idea of how to find the road. I pleaded with him that we hadn't meant to use his land, that we wouldn't do it again, that we were lost, and that it had been my idea to join the protest, so he should at least let Amy go. I don't know what he'd been planning to do or what he would do. I just hoped that by taking the blame it might wrong-foot him enough to not hurt us. I guess he must have been a bit lost himself, because after a few seconds, he started laughing, and I later found out from his wife that the shotgun wasn't even loaded and was too rusty to fire. Luckily, the protest camp was still noisy enough that without confusion of the chase, we could more or less just walk towards it. As we started to talk about why we'd been camping there, we even managed to bring him around a bit and offered to take some leaflets once Amy had gotten back to her feet, because obviously she didn't have any on her. I think at that point he noticed I'd lied about it being my idea to come, but with the tension gone and it being a noble lie anyway, he just laughed it off and offered us into the farmhouse for a cup of tea. I never did get a date with Amy, but we became very close friends, so I don't look back with too much shame on that night. I guess there's something about being at the other end of a very angry farmer holding a very real-looking shotgun which brings people together, even if it doesn't work well for romance. I never did return to the protest, and sometimes I wonder what happened with it. My name's Anton, and I'm from Germany, and please pardon if my English is not perfect. I learned to speak it from watching American TV and visiting America, and I taught myself. I'm an adventurer and hiker, and I spend much of my time camping and hiking all around Europe. Anywhere worth visiting, I've visited it, but the rest of the world had not been my playground yet. This is why for many years I harbored a dream of visiting finest Appalachia, the location of so many excellent scary stories and atmospheric adventures that I've seen. I'm a solo hiker, and I challenge myself to explore and survive in the wilderness alone. This has always been perfect for me, as I am a solitary individual, and throughout all of my travels in Europe, I have never encountered more than a few minorly troubling incidents. And this is why I, foolishly, embarked on a solo visit to the Appalachia Trail in the summer of 2014. I flew over to the States for my first visit and stayed with some friends that I'd known for some years online. Then I rented a car and drove to the foot of the trail that I was going to hike. I had promised my friends that I'd follow the marked trail rigidly, as they were concerned about me doing this alone, but secretly I had decided to go where the wind took me. I did stick to the trail for the first day or two, but then I diverted. I have many years of experience as an explorer, so keeping track of my route was no problem for me. I headed into an area that appealed to me. The trees were so huge and towering, unlike anything we have in Europe, and I was taken by the beauty surrounding me. That night, I set up my tent beside a small pond. The beauty of the American countryside took my breath away, and I basked in the silence and tranquility of this new world. Back in Germany, it is stunning, but Appalachia, at least where I was very unique, and I was awestruck. That night, I drifted off watching the stars, and eventually I crawled inside my tent to sleep. I awoke later to sounds, howling and calling. At first I thought it might be a pack of wolves. I didn't have a firearm as a German person on vacation in the States, but I had a hunting knife, and it is this that I held as I was just frozen there in my tent, listening intently. The howling soon settled into human voices, and I couldn't understand their words at first, if they were saying words at all, but then they began to chant. "If you leave, you'll die. If you leave, you'll die." I called out to them, as it was clear that they knew that I was inside the tent. "Leave where?" I asked. "Leave the tent," they said. "If you leave the tent, you will die." "Will you kill me?" I asked. No reply. A voice howled again, and then another said, "If you leave, you'll die." And next I heard footsteps. It sounded like they were circling the tent. Fear gripped me, unlike anything I had ever felt before in my solo adventures. Was this to be the end of me, here in some foreign land? Was my life to be cut short by these Americans who I had for so long held in such high regard? I shifted in the tent and a voice called back, "Do not come out." I listened, and instead gripped my knife tighter, just as fear gripped me. More steps, then the sound of someone running, shouts and a commotion that seemed to have nothing to do with me. A voice outside the tent spoke and told me to stay put, and so I did. I had lit a fire in the pit that night, and now I saw the light from my fire flaring back up, lit by one of the strangers outside. Another jolt of panic. What if they burned me alive? But I could see the fire was not too close to the tent, even through the canvas. I held back a scream as I heard one gunshot, and then another. The voice outside the tent reaffirmed that I should stay put. I thought about challenging that voice, emerging with my knife and fighting for my life. But for what? They told me that I would be okay if I stayed inside, and so I did. 2 more gunshots, and then some more hooting and laughter. Whoever was out there, they were having some kind of fun, and I didn't know what violence was occurring, if any, and I did not know how serious the danger was directly to me. All I knew was that the men outside continued to tell me to stay in the tent where I was. At some point during that long, terrifying night, the fire was extinguished again, and this allowed me to relax somewhat, knowing that I would not be set ablaze by unseen hands while cowering inside my shelter. Somehow, eventually, tiredness caused me to pass out. When I awoke, I could see the sun had risen. For a moment, I forgot about the events of the night before, but I urgently needed to urinate and started to unzip the tent. Everything returned to my memory, and I froze, then called out. No reply. I waited, listened, gripped the knife, and opened the tent. I could see no signs of anything that occurred in the night, except for the fact that some of the undergrowth had been trampled down. Sitting by the fire, though, was a 6-pack of beer. It had not been there when I went to bed. I didn't drink it. I just left it where it was. 2 days later, I emerged from that Appalachian Trail area with my dream trip cut short. I've since hiked the Appalachian Trail again, but not alone, and within the safety of the trail markers. I have asked many people what they think I may have experienced that night. Nobody has any clear answers, and I don't either. I try to convince myself that I was the victim of a cruel prank, but it's hard to know for sure. They say strange things happen on the Appalachian Trail. Germany is the same, but not quite as much. Appalachia is beautiful and haunted and dangerous.